Order this meeting of the Planning and Transportation Commission for June 29th. Robin, if you would please take roll.
Commissioner Alchek, Commissioner Downing, Chair Fine,
Present.
Vice Chair Gardias,
Present.
oh, this is an old one. Commissioner Rosenblum,
Present.
Commissioner Tanaka,
Present.
Commissioner Waldvogel,
Present.
5 present. And also, before we begin the meeting tonight, a reminder that the July 13th meeting is canceled.
Thank you very much. I don't believe there are any additions or deletions. Nope. Director Gittleman, if you have a report, we'd appreciate it. We can do oral communications first. Yep. Thanks. Any cards? None? None.
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you. Hillary Gittleman, the director. I'm standing in this evening for Jonathan Late, who's on a well-deserved vacation. Already on the East Coast, presumably laying on a beach somewhere, or will be in the morning. I just wanted to report on the City Council's activities of the last couple weeks. They've been busy because they're heading out on their summer break starting today. There was a meeting on June 20th where they considered the Commission's recommendation on the Midtown Connector. And they ultimately decided that they were not interested in pursuing that trail along the Matadero Creek and directed staff to consider that alternate alignment that you looked at on Loma Verde. So you'll probably hear more about that in the future. Then just this week, the council had 2 meetings, one on Monday and one on Tuesday night. On Monday night, they really discussed the idea of a business tax for transportation purposes. I don't know if you've been following that, but it was a really interesting discussion, and they ultimately decided not to put something on this year's ballot, but to start laying the groundwork to potentially put something on the ballot in 2017 or 2018. So I'm sure we will all be hearing more about that in the coming year. Then just last night, the council discussed the Commission's recommendation on the Maybell tentative map, and they followed your recommendation and approved the project last night, really with no changes, although there was quite a healthy discussion of a number of issues. Then finally, the council had jurisdiction over a change to the final subdivision map that was approved for the Mayfield development project at the end of California Avenue. And so there was a long discussion of that because of hazardous materials that have been found on the site. And ultimately, they ended up approving this minor amendment to the final map. And that's it. So they don't meet again until August 15th. We're already working on the staff reports for August 15th. So
Thank you very much, Director. I'd just like, for the record, Commissioner Downing has joined us. We have 2 items tonight: a comment letter related to the DEIR for 2 projects in Menlo Park, the Facebook campus project and for the comp plan update, and a study session tonight on some different measures of traffic and transit. Let's begin with item number 1. And does staff have a report?
I'd like to introduce Meg Monroe on our staff, who's going to take us through this first item and who's been working to prepare these draft letters.
Good evening. I'd like to just begin by saying I don't know that you've had an occasion to review one of these before, so I wanted to remind you that a draft environmental impact report is a disclosure document. And the purpose is to identify and to analyze environmental effects that a project might cause. And our responsibility as a city, when somebody prepares one of these, is to review it and focus on concerns that Palo Alto might have that for one reason or another might not have been addressed or might not have been adequately mitigated with their suggestions in the draft EIR. We make comments. We ask for either ask for information or we raise questions for further evaluation for those preparing the draft EIR. In this case, it would be to the City of Menlo Park and their consultants. As staff, we've prepared, I drew the short straw, maybe. I was the staff lead in planning on this, and I didn't do it by myself. I worked with Joe Teresi in Public Works, and his areas of focus are San Francisco Creek, flooding, and water quality. I worked with Jared Mullen, transportation planner. He looked at the traffic and bicycle circulation proposals that were made. And Jim Waldley, who's the manager of maintenance operations at the airport, who looked at impacts of the airport's presence would have on the development proposed. As staff, we've prepared 2 letters. They're attached to your staff report, A and B. We don't expect you to read the documents. I thought I'd bring them just so you could see what I did read. And to review our comments and add any questions that you might have that we would add to our comments. Before we sort of get into that part, it was suggested that we go briefly through a description of what the projects are to help you orient. And I have never used this PowerPoint before, so whoops. This one?
Above. Up, right, up higher, one more, up,
Oh.
up, to the right.
Oh, page down. See, okay. Sorry about that. There are 2, Menlo Park managed to release these 2 draft environmental documents virtually simultaneously, and one encompasses the other. So the larger document is the Connect Menlo document, which is the document on the general plan, the land use element update, and the circulation element for the whole city, plus the environmental analysis of some rezoning for the Bayfront area. The plan would increase the current, would include the Facebook expansion. So it's a little hard in reading the 2 draft EIRs to figure out which is what. But the plan is the larger document. Its main, besides refocusing, I'm going to go down here one more if I can. Yes, this is the land use map taken out of the draft EIR. The gray area at the top is the Bayfront area, which is the area that they are amending the land use designations for. And then they're also doing some amendment for the red area along El Camino Real. However, the draft EIR addresses the entire document, which includes the conservation and safety elements and so forth. And so the impacts that are shown or discussed are for the entire plan. The Facebook expansion project, let's see, I'll do this again. The Facebook expansion project is actually a redevelopment of a 58-acre parcel that is on the Bayfront. This is the site location map. You can see the area that's surrounded in black is the site. They would be building a total of 1,200,000 square feet of new floor area, but it's only a net increase of 121,300 square feet. In other words, they are virtually replacing what's there. But they are changing a lot of the uses from warehouse to office uses, and they're adding, at the very end, they're adding a hotel, which you can see on this slide. It's a little hard to see if you've got your ones at your desk. There are 2 new buildings, 22, I think it's 21 and 22, and then the hotel at the very end. The 2 buildings at either at the extreme ends, 20 and 23, are existing and will remain and be, their traffic impacts will be incorporated into the analysis, but those buildings aren't going to be expanded or changed. So that pretty much covers the projects and sort of a bird's eye view. The comments on the draft EIR for Connect Menlo are due on July 15, and the comments on the Facebook campus expansion are due on July 11. And our next step would be to get your comments and revise the letters as you see fit. I should note that at your desks you have a letter from Nielsen Buchanan at 155 Bryant Street. informing you of his concerns relating to the 2 draft DIRs. I'm assuming that Mr. Nielsen would submit that letter to Menlo Park, and I'd be happy to answer any questions or take any comments you have.
Thank you very much. Do we have any speaker cards on this issue?
So, as you suggested, we have a speaker card for Nielsen Buchanan. So, sir, if you could take, please, 5 minutes.
I'll try not to use 5 minutes. Nielsen Buchanan at 155 Bryant. I sort of have a fantasy what you might do at the end of this discussion, and that you would give yourself a self-appraisal on how well you prepared comments to another neighboring city. I personally think this is a unique opportunity to have some interface, commentary, even meet and confer with Menlo Park. The system is staged against any meaningful content and comment given the time frames that are on. That sort of confounds the whole process as far as I'm concerned. If you go to Development Tricks 101, you'll learn that first thing you do is to launch 2 big projects in a very tight time frame. That will make sure everybody is thoroughly confused and can't comment. That be as it may, that's the system that we operate under. If you were going to evaluate yourself, I have 2 polar examples of how you might want to evaluate yourself. If you think this is a relatively unimportant and benign process, that there's no traffic, there's no housing concerns between the 2 cities or nearby, then you could give yourself an A+. There's no reason to get very involved or do very much. The situation is harmless. On the other hand, if you think issues that confront our communities up and down the peninsula, and just using traffic and housing as 2 examples, are really important, and we're missing opportunities left and right to do something about it. The transportation tax was a prime example of get ready, aim, fire, and wait for the Palo Alto process to play out over the next 2 years. I would urge you to figure out which of the 2 scenarios are there. Is it relatively benign? This is a bureaucratic process, just go ahead and dismiss it going on. Or is this an opportunity that it could be a meet and confer comment period with some depth to it? It's a real thankless process at this point of how do you do something. I talked to several people in Palo Alto and in Menlo Park that isn't this something that should be done? And people, ordinary citizens, just throw their hands up that this is part of the process. It's hopeless. There's no reason to become involved. Expectations of the Planning Commission, city councils are so low that why get involved? I don't believe that is the case. I don't know how to solve this particular problem. I see it as a wonderful opportunity that is going to come and go. But if you chose to, there would be a chance to start meeting and conferring with Menlo Park about what really is going on outside the boundaries of the commentary of draft EIRs. I recall, and I think it was in the discussion of the TMA, that several overtures were made. We need to sit down and talk to the neighboring towns about whether the TMAs could be more compatible and more viable. That's just one tiny example, assuming we have a TMA to even talk about. So I close on hoping that you will have a healthy discussion on whether this is important or not, and if there's anything you could do better than what's going to happen tonight, and at the end of the day, give yourself a grade. I think that process starts a better dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Buchanan. No other cards, so I'd like to open it up to both comments and questions from commissioners. I think this is wrong. Commissioner Downing, I think you're first.
So I think you have correctly identified that we don't see all that many of these kind of letters. So I wanted to ask some background information just kind of before we kick off with comments. So the first one is, I do want to understand a little bit about EIRs and their scope, and whether or not or how unusual it is for an EIR that's for a particular city to take into account cities and streets and congestion outside of its jurisdiction. Is that a normal thing for another city to do?
Oh, thanks for the question. I think there is an obligation to look at the impacts wherever they might occur. With that said, obviously, cities focus primarily on their own jurisdiction, but if there are spillover impacts to other communities or facilities that are outside the city's jurisdiction, freeways, on-ramps, freeway segments, it is the agency's responsibility to identify those impacts.
Are there any examples of projects that have come up in the last year or two where Palo Alto's EIRs have studied impacts on either Menlo Park or Mountain View?
We have the Complan EIR that we've been working on for a while, and we do look at freeway segments and freeway ramps that are outside our jurisdiction. I don't remember exactly what the boundaries of our analysis are, but again, it is your obligation to identify the impacts where they would occur, irrespective of jurisdictional boundaries. And so we have tried to do that.
Can you think of a project that did that, though?
Well, we don't do a lot of EIRs. Did you? Oh, the hospital medical center was probably the last big EIR, and that did look at the impacts on adjacent jurisdictions, yes.
Okay. And then I guess, if a city found that, let's say Menlo Park looks at our letter. Let's say they decide that they fully mitigated. They believe that their EIR does the mitigation that it ought to do. Or in fact, they go ahead and decide that there are overriding considerations. At that point in time, what recourse, if any, does Palo Alto have against that assessment?
Well, I think it would be, I wouldn't want to speculate that we just wouldn't reach agreement. We're at the phase now where we're in good faith going to offer comments and hope that the comments will be responded to and the final EIR will be adequate in terms of addressing the impacts. I think you're getting to a point that is an important one, and that's partly the reason why we tend to bring these comment letters to the council and failing the council to the commission, because tone is important. I mean, the expression, what goes around comes around. If you make a snarky comment on someone's EIR, they're going to make one back to your EIR, So we don't want to enter into an arms race here. We want to be respectful, identify issues that we think need to be surfaced, ask respectful questions, and expect that our colleagues across the border will do the responsible and professional thing and respond in kind.
Okay, well, let me proceed to ask the lawyerly question. If for whatever reason we are unsatisfied with Menlo Park's determination, not that we would, but technically, do we have standing to sue on that EIR as a city?
Yes, the city does have standing to sue, and there actually have been some lawsuits, including lawsuits against Palo Alto, where other agencies have sued cities over EIR determinations.
Okay, so those are my questions for now. I'm going to hold off on comments until others have had a chance to ask their questions as well.
Thank you, Commissioner Downing. I don't see any other lights. Commissioner Rosenblum.
Yeah, I think that in your letter, there are a number of issues that you raised to the city. It was around hazards and hazardous material, and then traffic and some specific intersections to study. My guess is the community is largely concerned around traffic. So to the extent that this is a body that represents the community and their questions, it's around the impact on traffic in various places. The Facebook project, I would think, is the simpler of the two to evaluate because it's a more discrete project. And Facebook runs an active shuttle program and pulls their own employees. So they have a pretty good idea of where people are coming from. To what extent did Facebook cooperate? And so, as you noted, the whole EIR is a thick document, and so I might not have seen this. Is there a submission from Facebook on the point-to-point transportation plans of the marginal employees that they would house in these facilities? So, i.e., what we'd be concerned about in particular is how many of them would have to transit through Palo Alto. So, to what extent would that overburden some of our roadways? And they probably already have this data. And certainly, I know when I worked at Google, we had it, and we knew where every employee was coming from and had pretty detailed maps on this.
I didn't see anything in the document about origin destination of employees. I think it's a legitimate question to ask them, and nor did they expound upon their TDM program beyond saying that they ought to have one.
Yeah.
And you may have noted our response about that short-term's fine, but what if there are 50 businesses there later?
Yeah.
And so that's really what I think the planning department would make a condition on the approval.
Yeah, so that's what I would ask for, is a detailed Facebook plan, and also the data that Facebook currently has on number of expected marginal employee counts, and then the expected burden on Palo Alto streets, and then what TDM measures they expect to have in place, which I know you've asked for. But they, again, I assume they actually have planned this. This shouldn't be a burden on them.
And they do have a program in place, so yeah, they should have information, yes.
Yeah. The Menlo Park plan is in some ways similar, but they don't know what the impacts will be of zoning for additional housing. But I wanted to ask some questions about that. So is it correct they're planning on zoning for additional 5,500 units?
That's
what
they indicated.
Over what period of time?
To 2040.
2040, right? So this is in line. And so how does that compare to their ABAG commitment?
It's a lot higher than their ABAG.
Yeah, so the first comment I wanted to make is, as you know, to the extent that we're doing our job in commenting as a planning commission to a neighboring city, is huge kudos. These guys are stepping up to the plate and helping out with our regional problem of housing. So to the extent taking this job seriously and commenting on what they are planning next door, both the idea that they are taking a regional problem by the horn, adding an attractive employer nearby where they're adding their housing, it seems like a rational thing to do. Having said that, 5,500 units obviously adds pressure on the infrastructure itself. And so the other area I would comment on is as part of the comprehensive plan, they should have an idea of the sources of funding for the TDM. So they have ambitions for a TDM, but not where the funding would come from. And I know that this will feel hypocritical coming from Palo Alto, but again, as the planning commissioner, that is what I'd want to look for, is adding a significant population, and what is their plan to mitigate. The specific intersections that you identified to study, I think are the obvious ones. But by the same token, I think that having these two projects together is useful. Seeing the Facebook transit commute patterns, and they should have more detailed data than even the city of Menlo Park, I would guess, should give an idea of what a dramatic expansion of the city of Menlo Park should do to traffic patterns. And I know those are two different things, employer versus housing. I fear they don't have the data on where the pattern of commuting comes from people living in Menlo Park. But certainly whatever data they currently have, I didn't see it in the current EIR. And so to the extent that you can extrapolate this, I think they should submit that to us, which is destinations for current working population in Menlo Park. Because it's such a significant population expansion.
The working and the residents?
Correct.
Okay.
And I would agree with Mr. Buchanan in the sense that this is a dramatic population expansion, which, again, as I said, I'm happy that one of our communities is stepping up for this. But there are implications, and I don't think that the draft EIR addressed where that additional load is going to be distributed. Those are all the basic questions I have for now. I have some additional comments after other commissioners might have their turn.
Thank you, Commissioner Rosenblum. Commissioner Waldfogel.
Thank you. Let's see, a couple comments on this. One, I think, is an amplification of Commissioner Rosenblum's question. But when you look at this and look at assumptions about transit use, potential transit use, where does the transit capacity on the peninsula get coordinated between different agencies? So if Menlo Park is assuming that they can use every transit seat that's projected on Caltrain, and Sunnyvale and Santa Clara and Palo Alto, who coordinates that and who keeps score? And I don't know whether that we can resolve this through this process, but it might be interesting to start a dialogue through this process if that's possible. Second point, I want to thank you for raising, for coordinating with the airport team and looking at those issues. I think there are also some state law issues. I think there's some issues potentially about San Mateo County's compliance with state law on land use plan. So I think that should be surfaced, and maybe just ask them what their intent is around that, and just ensure that they're complying with relevant state law and disclosures that are required. So those are really two principal comments I would raise on this. But otherwise, I think that it's a good start on a letter, and it's thank you for reading all those documents so we don't have to.
Thank you. Commissioner Tanaka.
I have a quick question. So how much of an increase in population is this for Menlo Park? I guess in terms of households and in terms of office, in terms of people.
I think it about doubles the population by 2040. It increases the employment a little bit more than that.
Do you know how much more?
Not a whole lot more. In other words, the daytime population, the nighttime population, I think would be about the same.
It's on 4.11-17 of the report, by the way, just in case you're curious. It's 53% growth rate in population, 52% in households, 72% in employees.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's very significant.
Yes.
Okay, great, thank you.
Vice Chair Gardias.
Thank you. So in addition to those comments that my colleagues just expressed, and I'm not sure if their draft EIR already includes the methodology of calculation. We know that it's going to be changing because we will be having the same discussion in a couple of minutes, right? So I'd be curious if they would be, in addition to the old CEQA methodology, if they would be also in updated document, they would be translating this to the new document that would be just showing the vehicle miles traveled. So that's number one. And in terms of methodology, because having such an impactful increase of the population, this will surely impact the adjacent streets and roads in very significant way, and that methodology needs to be updated and clearly presented. I can foresee that, for example, those housed employees that would be in the vicinity of the main campus may decide, because of the simple leisure desire, to travel on Friday evening, thus adding to the clogged street. And those that would be traveling home, this way they will pretty much double traffic on Dumbarton Bridge, and that will impact Willow, and that will impact Middlefield or University, and pretty much the cars will stall in Palo Alto. So they would have to clearly and carefully look at the impact and at the adjacent municipalities and merger arteries. So that would be my comment in terms of methodology, and of course disclose it to us. I have not studied the document. It might be there, but I think this is a fair comment to ask. In terms of from a different side, in terms of the height, could you tell us, knowing that their new development would be going to 75 feet, is their current campus currently at 75, or it's going over that limit?
I think that one building connects to an existing building, which is must be close to that because the roofs connect. But the buildings that are there on the site now are about 35 feet. The ones that will be removed.
35, but there is a Hacker Way, right? One Hacker Way, the campus that's in the very close proximity, Those buildings, they are at 75
I don't
feet?
think that, I think they're like 54.
Okay, so they are pretty much going significantly
They're- Yeah.
over the limit, right? So understanding this, my question and concern would be pretty much changing the view profile of the bay, because this way we're pretty much putting a number of the tall buildings on the waterfront, and that significantly changes the way that we're gonna pretty much see the bay, right? Knowing that all over the bay, at least on the east side, there is action to return the former industrial salt conversion to the nature, and then pretty much it automatically just puts all the development beyond the marshes.
Right.
But here we're just doing something else. We're just putting the tall architecture on the very close to the water. So my concern would be about the impact of the changing landscape at the bay parameter.
Okay.
How this reconciles with everybody's expectation of this, how bay would look like in many years from now. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair. I just want to thank staff for going over this and putting together a pretty concise and I think fairly appropriate letter to Menlo Park. I also appreciate that the staff reached out to Palo Airport. I think that's an important one. So at least my first question, what other groups were contacted across Palo Alto? Were there any, or were you just
the
taking
ones I
feedback?
described. Public Works, this is a staff reviewed
Okay.
thing.
And you just reached out to the airport because you thought it was...
I talked to, yes, the operator of the airport.
Okay, good. So I completely agree with Commissioner Rosenblum that there is a need to send Menlo Park some kudos for taking on a pretty ambitious plan like this, given our regional need for it. And I think Palo Alto could probably go a bit further in emphasizing that Menlo Park specify the physical infrastructure improvements that are needed for some of those assumptions. A few of them that come to mind, one is, as Vice Chair just mentioned, access to the bay or views of it. There's the whole Bay Trail there. I think there's partially stuff planned through Don Edwards area, but it's not built out yet. I'm not sure how this plan will affect that. There's also an opportunity for us to convey experiences that Menlo Park might be experiencing that we already have. So one that came to mind is retail preservation. I don't know if Menlo Park's interested in that at the moment, but I'm assuming they probably have similar problems to Palo Alto, and it may be worth considering or giving them our experiences. I think the area that concerned me the most was kind of this confluence where Menlo Park, Palo Alto, and East Palo Alto all come together. There's a whole lot of roads there that are packed during commute hours. If you go through there nowadays, there's a much, much larger bicycle commuter population going through there, whether it's going to businesses in Redwood City, to Google and Mountain View, or to Facebook from any area on the peninsula. I don't think we've been strong enough in emphasizing how important that area is through like Bellhaven, along 84, along the Bay Trail, Willow, really large bicycling areas, and I think we could emphasize that a bit more. I was a little surprised that, the city had to comment, oh, well, your bike plan's out of date. You're not showing the latest routes. Go check out this manual. So there might be a bit more digging there. Two questions, not related to this. So one is, when is ABAG next update their projections? Do we know?
I'm not sure.
They're actually in the process of doing that right now. They're going through kind of a scenario process. And I forget, I think sometime this fall, they're supposed to land on a scenario and then have a set of projections to follow.
Okay. And this plan, will Menlo Park have to update anything once those are released, or they're getting it in before then? Okay. And the second question is, do we know what East Palo Alto is commenting about on this? Have they already submitted their letter? Do we have any idea?
I don't know. The communities don't normally share their letters. They send them to Menlo Park. So I assume that they have some response.
Yeah, I hope so too. I guess just for me, this area is becoming a lot hotter in terms of development pressures and transit pressures and work stuff. There may be some advantage to maybe us sharing our letter with East Palo Alto and seeing if they have any comments. I think that also speaks to Mr. Buchanan's point about regional cooperation for these regional issues. This is a huge use of land. I think the Bay Area and the South Bay here is very privileged to have a company like Facebook located here, but there's big pressures that need to be addressed regionally as well. That's my first pass. So, Commissioner Downing?
So my next comment, I think has to do with tone, but also has to do with content. I think I've said this before, but I think in general, when we as a city in Palo Alto, when we look at EIRs, we look at DIRs, we tend to look at it in a legally prescribed manner, right? The difference between doing this thing or not doing this thing. But the correct way to actually look at something is not between doing and not doing it, but the future of what that looks like, right? So what I mean by that is, in the letter we make this comment of, oh, there's going to be all these people and all this housing and it's going to have all this impact. But I would sort of caution Palo Alto in making those kind of comments, because the real question should be, well, what happens if they build out that Facebook campus and don't add any housing? Right? Because we're complaining about the impact of the 5,500 units of housing, whereas in reality, they're doing us a favor by building that housing. That's 5,500 people that aren't driving through Palo Alto to get to their Facebook jobs. And so I just feel like it would be useful if we could kind of look at it from that perspective, right? I mean, yes, the Facebook project is one thing, but the housing they're building out and the other things they're doing as part of their plan and as part of their infrastructure is another. So before we get too committed to complaining about how much housing they're adding or how much population they're adding, we should really ask ourselves, is it really in our best interest if they don't add that stuff at all? And I don't actually think it is. The fact that they're adding housing means that there's less housing pressure in Palo Alto. That means that our rents won't skyrocket as much as they would if they didn't add that housing. So I would like to see that somehow worked in here. The number one concern that people in Palo Alto have is about housing and about housing affordability. And this letter really seems to be only full of complaints, whereas in reality, they're doing us a big service by building out housing there. That's less pressure on our most vulnerable people.
Well, maybe I can interject. Some of your colleagues have suggested that we start by saying, thank you for, being aggressive or forward-looking in providing the housing, but ... please address these impacts related to the strain on infrastructure and other things. If we use that approach, would we be responsive to your suggestion?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it's one thing, the way that the letter is phrased now, it's sort of like we're concerned about the impact to the population and the housing. The population and the housing aren't hurting us. Those are good things for us. Like, if we're serious about actually looking at this from a practical perspective, then yeah, I think addressing, okay, but what about the infrastructure? What about your roads? What about your water? What about your electricity? Right? Those are all legitimate things to be concerned about and to worry about and to write them about. But getting upset about them building housing is not one of them. So, like I said, it can't just be a matter of, what would this look like without this project and what does it look like with this project? It's, well, what does it look like without this project 10 years from now? That's the real question. We're so focused on impacts that are so, I understand we're looking at the EIR, but we're so focused on like the EIR impacts of like, oh, traffic and what's this going to look like at this particular intersection or that intersection. But there is a lot to be grateful for as well, right? And even though it's not an EIR impact, the affordability of Palo Alto, people's ability to keep living here and not be pushed out by Facebook workers is a really big thing.
Thank you. Commissioner Rosenblum.
So I agree with Commissioner Downing's comments in general. However, I think our job as planning commissioners is to think about the impacts on our city and how to mitigate those, even though, like I said, I'm very admiring that they're taking this bold step. I think a lot of the request, again, the specific request is to study the intersections, and you have identified the obvious intersections. And as I said, you may identify additional intersections when you understand the patterns of commute from a more detailed submission from someone like Facebook to see how people are actually coming through our community. The area to dig into is their traffic model. And that was alluded, or not alluded to, you've asked for more detail about the traffic model in your letter. And I think that is the place to dig. Now, in terms of the process, I think this is going to take you some time. So they've developed a model that spits out what they expect the traffic to be at all major intersections in Menlo Park. And I have a feeling that it's disconnected from, I don't know exactly what these models look like. I have a feeling that it's done not in complete connection with how an effective TDM program may be implemented, because the TDM section of the same document is extremely light and only gives a few suggestions for measures that might be taken and some principles of TDM. And this is where I was saying that the thing that would make me feel better as a Palo Alto resident, knowing that a population is about to double in size, our neighbor, is that they've identified funding sources commensurate with this ambitious plan. And so it's not just the traffic model, but to understand how they plan on paying for the offsets. And that part, so they've listed some general TDM principles, but I don't think they've even discussed where the money would come from. Unless, I may be missing that. I'm on a section of TDM measures and principles.
I'm sorry, did you have a section number?
Yeah, I'm going to go back up to it. Give me a moment.
Sorry.
Transportation demand management guidelines are 4.13-10.
Okay.
And unless there's a more detailed section, this is one of the lighter sections of the plan. It alludes to some work that may be ongoing in parallel, so there may be a much more detailed project that's going on. Similarly, they similarly allude to the El Camino Real downtown specific plan in the following section with similar kind of very high-level principles, and so I suspect that there's a much more detailed plan that's behind each of these, but it's not in this plan. And the one that I would be most, actually let me amend that. Both the specific plans and the TDM plan would be important to having confidence that they could accommodate this kind of growth in households and employment. That's the sum of my comments. Thank you.
Great, thanks.
Do we have any other commissioners with questions, comments? Vice Chair.
Just a minor comment, but it might be also important. So there may be, because there will be bringing some population from the outside due to their expansion, there may be also impact on the railroad, on the Caltrain. So I was wondering if they might have already stated that, but if not, I would like to understand what's the critical point at which a population trying to reach Menlo Park would overwhelm or would become so significant, then pretty much we will have to have another stop in Menlo Park that would be added to the bullet trains. There may be some inflection point that the train would be reaching, because if people want to go to Menlo Park as opposed to Palo Alto,
Redwood
right,
City,
they may want to just add another stop, which would add to the delays. So that would be my question. Thank you.
I think that's all. Commissioner Tanaka.
This is part of a smaller issue, but in terms of parking, there was much analysis done around that. So for instance, recently there's been issues about spillover parking coming over from other cities. Have you thought about that, and what do you think the impacts will be?
The parking for the Facebook project met the code requirements, and there is the implicit assumption in the plan that the parking for the development of the plan would meet the parking requirements in the zoning code. So I don't think, and as far as I know, unlike situations that we have on the edge of parts of East Palo Alto, there has been no parking spillover that I'm aware of from Menlo Park into Palo Alto.
So even if there's a significant increase in units on Menlo Park side, you don't see any potential impact on Palo Alto?
Right.
Okay, thank you.
All right, I think that's about it from us. Just one last question, it's a bit tongue-in-cheek. Why is their plan for 2040 and ours is only for 2030?
I'm sorry, what?
Why is their plan for 2040 and ours is only for 2030? When I saw it, I'm like, gosh, we should...
It turns out that when this plan was proposed, it was for 2035, and I believe they extended it to 2040 because of the ABAG horizon. So I can't answer the question for Palo Alto.
We started doing our plan for 2025, and now we're at 2030. So,
Maybe
every agency kind of chooses what they want.
Maybe we should extend ours so, all this hard work we're putting in, we can avoid it for
Right.
30
Well,
years.
thank you, commissioners, for your comments. We'll get these letters fixed up and out the door. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Do you all want to keep going or take a 5-minute break? Let's take just 5 minutes.
Yeah.
study session on level of service, multimodal level of service, bicycle level of stress, vehicle miles traveled, and CEQA changes related to transportation impacts. This is a study session for us, so we can just listen, learn, ask some questions. Just for a little bit of context, the CAC is currently discussing the transportation element of the comp plan, and there was discussion last week on whether the city should keep on using level of service or just move straight on to VMT. Seemed like most of the CAC was in favor of using both going forward, but that is a discussion that the CAC is going through in order to open the question up for council. This is a great opportunity for us to learn about these methodologies and produce some fodder for council to think about it. Of course, a lot of these changes are occurring because of Senate Bill 743, which is kind of the death knell for automotive LOS. Anyways, if staff has a report, please take it away.
Greeting, Commissioners. I'm Josh Mello, the city's Chief Transportation Official. I'm joined this evening with a whole contingent of experts on all of these topics. To my right is Sarah Peters from the consulting firm Farren Peers. To her right is Hugh, who is with Alto Planning and Design. We have Ron Milam, who is with Farren Peers. I actually had the honor of sitting in a presentation that Ron gave last year at the Institute for Transportation Engineers National Conference in Las Vegas. He's been very involved in the changes to CEQA that we're going to hear about this evening. Robert Eccles, who's also with Farren Peers, behind him. And then we have Ruta Jarawala and Nayan Amin with TJKM. They conduct quite a few traffic studies in Santa Clara County, so they're also available. And we also have Rafael Rios, who's our chief, our traffic engineering lead, who does a lot of our traffic signal operations and up until recently worked quite a bit on traffic impact analyses. So tonight we're going to give you an overview of motor vehicle level of service. We're also going to talk a little bit about the, the guidelines that have been developed by the Santa Clara Valley Transportation Authority in regard to traffic impact analyses. We're going to cover the changes that are coming to CEQA and the identification of impacts as they relate to our transportation network. And then we're going to cap it off with a discussion about multimodal level of service, bicycle level of stress, and then some of the pros and cons of the different measurements of pedestrian and bicycle level of service that are out there. So Sarah Peters is going to kick it off, followed by Hugh. Oh, you got to use the mouse there and then push the...
Hi, thank you. There we go. So first we'll talk about what is a transportation impact analysis. So briefly, a transportation impact analysis evaluates the impacts of proposed land use changes and identifies on the transportation system, and it identifies measures to mitigate those impacts. Historically, TIAs have focused on the auto mode, and what that has unintendedly resulted in is a preference of auto throughput over all other modes, walking, bicycling, and also the use of transit. So recently, agencies around the Bay Area and around the United States have looked to expand the focus of TIAs to address those other modes. Here in Santa Clara County, BTA is the congestion management agency. So as part of its role, it publishes guidelines to ensure that TIAs that are developed at the local level are consistent in how they analyze impacts to major roadways in Santa Clara County. These guidelines were last updated in 2014 and included several new elements. VTA requires a TIA for any project that would generate 100 or more net new trips during any peak hour. However, Palo Alto and several other cities around Santa Clara County typically require that a TIA be conducted for a smaller project, maybe generating only 50 trips in a peak hour. And note that the transportation impact analysis requirements from VTA are very different from the ones required by CEQA analysis, even before SB 743. So VTA requires that TIAs analyze both current and future conditions when adding project traffic to the CMP network. And typically that means that a TIA is going to analyze 3 scenarios. So existing conditions, that's existing traffic levels plus your project traffic. Background conditions, that's existing traffic plus traffic from projects that have already been approved but not yet constructed. And then cumulative conditions, and that's those background conditions plus anticipated growth. And often that anticipated growth is estimated for a specific horizon year using a travel demand model. VTA also sets thresholds for impacts within the CMP network. So those impact thresholds are defined in terms of auto level of service, briefly a measure of delay at intersections or congestion on freeway segments. So auto LOS, as you know, is graded between LOS-A, which is free-flowing traffic, and LOS-F, which is major delays. For CMP facilities, that's major roadways and freeway segments. LOS-E is the standard, and an impact occurs when added traffic would cause the LOS to drop from E to F or would substantially exacerbate congestion at a facility that's already operating at LOS-F. Historically, local jurisdictions have used these guidelines to evaluate impacts to their local intersections, but often have adapted them to local conditions. And note also that these guidelines typically address isolated intersections, but where queuing can occur spillback from a single intersection to other intersections upstream, VTA does require additional queuing analysis. Here in Palo Alto, for local intersections, auto LOS is set at D, and Palo Alto has also identified impact thresholds for queuing for transit, pedestrian, and bicycle modes, and has also identified a threshold for cut-through traffic on neighborhood streets. Nearby jurisdictions can also provide some context for Palo Alto's thresholds. So broadly, Palo Alto has pretty consistent thresholds as other local jurisdictions. Note, however, that Mountain View has some interim thresholds of LOS-E within its downtown core and the San Antonio areas, and that's been established to recognize the multimodal nature of transportation in those areas. The 2014 update of VTA's TIA guidelines also expanded the requirements for evaluating other modes. So it added a transit delay requirement, asking the question, does added project traffic create delay for buses operating on local streets? It also added a requirement to evaluate bicycle and pedestrian conditions using a quality of service metric in any situation where a project or mitigation measures for a project's impacts would alter a roadway or intersection. And finally, the 2014 guidelines update encourages a broader approach to understanding trip generation. So for example, at a mixed-use site like you see here, you would want to use a methodology that really takes into account the crossover between retail uses on the ground floor and residential uses upstairs. The guidelines also added a new approach to understanding how trip reductions might occur as a result of a TDM program or as a result of a TDM requirement at the local level. We'll hand it over to Ron Milam next to talk about SB 743.
Thank you very much. First, a little background about why I'm giving this particular part of the presentation. We were hired by the Governor's Office of Planning and Research to help them develop a white paper on VMT. How do you calculate it? How do you set thresholds? Since that time, we've also been hired by Caltrans and a number of other cities, counties, LA, San Francisco, Pasadena, to help them develop their methodology and their thresholds for shifting from level service to VMT as the new CEQA metric. So that's a little bit of background. As it relates to what you can expect with Senate Bill 743, the title of this slide is An Evolutionary Change to Transportation Impact Analysis. It's going to be probably what it feels like. And it really did start back in 2006 with AB 32, and this is where the state basically said climate change, greenhouse gas reduction are very important state goals and policies, and we need to work towards that and starting to change other laws, including CEQA, to align with the state policy on greenhouse gases. So you see SB 97 up there was the first time the legislature actually gave us a new metric, and it was greenhouse gases. They told us within CEQA we have to analyze greenhouse gases. They didn't tell us how. And they didn't tell us what the threshold were, and we're still fighting about that in the courts. So fast forward to Senate Bill 743. I'm not sure we're upright and walking yet, but the legislature is definitely more active. Not only did they give us a new metric, and it is VMT, vehicle miles traveled, they did let OPR select that particular metric. They had a choice. But they also required OPR to develop guidance on the specific methodology and the thresholds. So helping all of us to understand what constitutes an unacceptable or an acceptable level of VMT. That's a pretty substantial change compared to traditional practice. When you think about the thresholds, every lead agency has the discretion to set their own thresholds unless the environmental topic is governed by a federal or state law, Endangered Species Act, Clean Air Act, those kinds of things. So you have a lot of discretion at the local level to choose for yourselves what VMT threshold is appropriate. But OPR is providing in their guidance where they think you should be drawing the line. Let's go to the next slide. It's also important when you think about a new law like this is pay attention to the legislative intent. The lawyers in the room do, the judges do, if there are legal challenges. And the legislature was pretty clear here in what they were expecting with this particular change. And item 2 here is particularly important. You'll notice here that they want to more appropriately balance the needs of congestion management, and the word management is specific here. It's not congestion relief. The state's not saying we need to relieve congestion. We expect it to continue to grow, but we want to manage that and balance it against our other objectives or values. And there's actually 3 here. Infill development, they want to encourage infill development. They want to promote public health through active transportation, that's bicycling and walking. And they want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So we actually have 3 objectives. And when you think about the VMT metric, it can be a proxy for all 3. It's more useful in the calculation of greenhouse gases from mobile sources. There are other metrics that might be more meaningful for active transportation, mode split, for example, or just the number of bicycle or walking trips. So while OPR is providing us guidance on VMT, the law suggests there's at least 3 objectives you want to be thinking about. So as you think about new transportation metrics, you have the option to follow the OPR guidance, but you can also develop your own methods, your own metrics, your own thresholds. Let's go to the next slide. I also want to point out some things that 743 does not do, because there's been a lot of confusion within the transportation planning practice that somehow vehicle level service has gone away permanently, and it really hasn't. Nothing in 743 has changed general plan law. It hasn't changed the Constitution. It hasn't changed Subdivision Map Act or other ways that a city or county can condition projects. So to the extent that vehicle level service is still important to a community, you can continue to use it in all those different aspects of your planning. And it's still a very useful metric when you're analyzing traffic operations if you're using it to size your intersections, your roadway segments. And we've had a lot of history with that. So a lot of cities and counties that rely on level service, what will likely happen is they won't see it so often showing up in environmental documents, but it will be a fundamental part of their general plan analysis or impact fee programs. And we have a number of jurisdictions we're already working with that intend to continue doing both types of analysis. So it's really important that we recognize it did not go away entirely. It's still around for those communities that want to use it. Now, we do have some communities. They're largely almost built out. They don't need to continue expanding the road network, or they don't want to. And they are willing to shift entirely to a VMT metric because they don't need to use the level service metric anymore. Let's go to the next slide. So if you don't remember anything else about the presentation, remember this slide, because this is what 743 really does, and what's probably the most important thing to recognize, and will be one of the challenges that cities have to deal with, counties as well. When you think about vehicle level service and the way we mitigate for it, the picture there of mobility on the top is an intersection being expanded to accommodate a better level of service. That's a pretty common outcome of using vehicle level service as a CEQA metric. And developers have become accustomed to that. They're used to paying to widen an intersection, install a traffic signal, or pay an impact fee that goes to widening the road system. When you talk about VMT, though, the way you mitigate VMT for a project is you change the project. You increase its density. You add more people to the site. You change the diversity of uses, more mixed-use type projects. Or you overlay a TDM program. This is something that developers are still getting used to. When you deal with VMT and other aspects of an environmental impact document, we already analyze it in the energy section, the greenhouse gas section, and the air pollution section. In many of those other sections, though, we can typically mitigate, for example, with greenhouse gases, through offsets. We can offset the emissions associated with the mobile sources. When you put VMT into the transportation section, you have to physically reduce the VMT, change the number of vehicle trips, or shorten their length. And that means changing the project in some way, shape, or form that's going to be different than what the developer proposed. that's going to be a pretty big evolutionary change for a lot of cities and counties and for the developers themselves that aren't used to having to change their project based on what the traffic engineers or the transportation planners recommended. A couple of other things that are important here. When you think about the other aspects of 743, encouraging the active transportation or infill, it does create a new dialogue about should we be analyzing the specific impacts to bikes and peds differently, and even safety. A lot of communities that have level service C or D thresholds and don't have queuing at a lot of their intersections or their off-ramps haven't really thought as much about safety because they didn't have to deal with long queues and the problems those might cause. By eliminating level of service in the environmental document, now a lot of cities and counties are rethinking their processes to understand, do we need to look at safety a little differently? As I mentioned earlier, OPR is creating guidance. There's been 2 versions of that guidance. The current version was out in January. This fall, they expect to finalize that. It'll go to the Natural Resources Agency for rulemaking. That takes about 6 months. From that point forward, it'll become law, and they're probably going to include a 2-year grace period before you're absolutely required to implement it. Now, some jurisdictions like San Francisco have already jumped to implementing it, so they went ahead and took OPR's January 20th guidelines and said we're going to use them as is. And then the final thing I want to mention is this question of thresholds. That one's going to be very important. Every city and county already has a VMT threshold based on their general plan. When you adopted your general plan, you decided how much population, employment growth, and associated transportation infrastructure you felt was necessary. When we run that through our models, we end up coming out with VMT. It's a composite metric. It comes out at the end of the process. So right now you have a budget, and one of the questions will be, do you set a threshold based on your current general plan, because all projects need to be consistent with your general plan, or do you follow the guidance from OPR, which suggests a 15% reduction in VMT per capita compared to your baseline levels? And baseline under CEQA always changes. It's tied to when a project's actually proposed. So it's a pretty aggressive threshold that will be very challenging for projects, especially in rural or suburban areas. A little easier here in the urban areas where you have transit options and those kinds of things. So that's another thing to keep in mind. Now, this has just been a very broad overview. I also teach an 8-hour class on this, so I anticipate you might have some questions, but at this point, I'll turn it back over to Josh and the gang. Thank you.
I'm going to get closer. Sorry. So switching gears a little bit, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about measuring bicycle and pedestrian comfort and stress. So switching from sort of thinking about the impacts to thinking about how do we understand what makes people use active transportation modes and the ways you can encourage that and understand better what drives those decisions, really. And you know, I think overall there's this sort of general trend, you know, this is sort of a piece of a larger trend where folks are kind of recognizing the importance of measuring the way this transportation system performs and needing to understand how the active transportation system performs sort of on the same level as the way that the automobile, the transportation system focused on automobiles performs. So starting with the same kind of level of service, there's been a lot of work at the national level and really a lot of states and cities and other agencies have thought about how do we bring up you know, bicycle and pedestrian travel to the same kind of level and transit as well. And you know, VTA has some things that you've already seen that they're trying to do and sort of fit in that same framework of level of service where, you know, A is a really good level of service and F is terrible. And they use sort of equivalent kinds of methods and approaches. And really, I think the attempt here, which has been driven, you know, like I say, from a lot of different angles, but the most recent stuff, I guess, is coming out of the Highway Capacity Manual and the Transportation Research Board, who do a lot of this kind of research. And so on the bicycle side, they're looking at things like driveways and volumes, speed, percentage of heavy vehicles, and widths of lanes and things like that, parking, cross-street widths, and other similar kinds of things. And on the pedestrian side, you know, they're looking at things like pedestrian density, so how much space is there available for pedestrians traveling, as well as other kind of similar things that, as I mentioned, on the bicycle side. But most of these methods really kind of derive or kind of have been derived from wanting to compare them essentially to the automobile side, and really have that, and in a way that's a benefit, really have that kind of comparable grading system that you have for automobiles. So if you take a road, you can say this is an A for autos and an F for bicyclists, or it's a B for autos and a C for bicyclists, or whatever kinds of things you might want to look at there. So, that's really, it has an advantage, but it also has a little bit of a disadvantage in that you're kind of focused on thinking about, this one framework that maybe doesn't really relate to the way bicyclists and pedestrians use the transportation system on a day-to-day basis. So certainly that comparability is good. Being able to consider on the same level that interaction across modes can be kind of handy when you're thinking about, well, what choices do I have to make? And ultimately, this is what that comes down to. And then at a national level, there's sort of some consistency around this. And then some of the cons, that we kind of see, the models that have been developed have really been developed around arterials and major collectors primarily. The analysis that they've done, the data they've collected, they kind of show people these videos and ask them to rate them. They're all based on these sort of larger, more significant streets, whereas the bicycle and pedestrian system, or especially really the local streets, the paths, the other kinds of elements of that system that make it a complete system are pretty important elements, and it's important to sort of think about your measures of bicycle comfort and pedestrian comfort, taking into account the whole system. I just wanted to kind of flash up a couple quick examples that we have. These are actually from Jacksonville, and they just show you kind of the idea here, which is pretty understandable and straightforward. So you take the system, you rate it, you get a rating from A to F. You can kind of see, okay, well, these are where we have parts of the system that maybe don't work so well for bicyclists or pedestrians. And you still have to ask the question, well, does that matter, right? Are these parts of the system you want to work well? Are there alternatives? Are there other places you might want to look? And then you'll notice this is very much focused on a high level. This is, again, back up at that kind of arterial collector kind of level. And then a similar thing at the pedestrian level. And of course, you can zoom in, you can try and rate stuff in a more detailed way. But this sort of big picture understanding of these are the parts of the system that work well or don't work well. And at some level, that's kind of effective, right? Because then you've taken these kinds of methods and you've started to understand how you can use them. Or start to understand what your system looks like. So that's something to think about. A couple other quick examples on the left. We have an example from Charlotte. They have a different approach to measuring level of service, and really what they're trying to do is look at, well, if we're doing a roadway project, how does that impact bicyclists and pedestrians? So, how do we take the features of that project and say these aren't good? And this is an example of kind of slip lanes. And if you're putting those in, or if you have those, how can you adjust them in a way that is better for bicyclists and pedestrians? And so they score their projects. They kind of give them points based on that. And that example is in your in the packet you got. And then on the right, there's an example from San Francisco that really is very similar to level of service. They use a variety of different kind of factors that go beyond, I would say, what the level of service metrics use. So they look at intersection safety, they look at traffic kind of issues. They also look at street design, they look at land use, and they consider kind of perceived safety types of issues. And in the end, they have 31 different indicators, which is probably more than most people are going to want to look at when they're thinking about this type of analysis. So that's kind of the level of service, multimodal level of service part of this. It's a method. It's been a lot of research has gone into it. There's a great understanding and use of that. I think there are quite a few states like Florida and others that have their own level of service manuals that they require that include, looking at pedestrians and bicyclists and transit in addition to thinking about automobiles. And that's a great evolution. But then sort of a further evolution on that's a little bit more recent that started down here at San Jose State is this kind of level of traffic stress concept. And the concept's not necessarily all that different from level of service, but the real issue here is trying to relate these levels of traffic stress to the types of users. And so, Roger Geller has these 4 types of bicyclists that have been identified, from the sort of strong and fearless, the very small portion of the population who will ride on an arterial 45, 55 miles an hour, doesn't care, all the way down to the people who say, of course, I will never ride a bicycle ever. And really, the key observation he makes, I think, which is really useful, is there's this very large portion of the population that might be willing to ride, but is concerned and is going to want to ride on facilities that are lower stress. And so trying to relate an analysis to these different concepts, so from the strong and fearless through the kind of enthused and confident who will ride on many facilities, if not the very worst, to those who are these interested but concerned. And then these are facilities that are for, most adults, all the way down to facilities that, you would let your children ride on without concern. So trying to make that connection is probably the key evolution, I think, of the level of traffic stress. And it's something that, using an example, again, from San Jose, where you kind of rate each of these roads, and now you're looking at a kind of broader set of roads. And what you're really looking for are, where are these gaps? So you can kind of see the green areas are areas where there's connectivity across the different or within the network. So you can make a movement at a very low level of stress. And then where you see the darker colors, you're seeing where there are issues and there are gaps in between those parts of the network. And that's really what it helps you do. It helps you start to see these kinds of gaps in the network for bicyclists, really from that perspective. And there are similar kind of simplified level of service metrics, I would say, that you can do on the pedestrian side as well, that really try to look at, what is that kind of connectivity of the system. So the other evolution that we've worked on recently that I think is pretty interesting and worth looking at is taking that level of traffic stress concept and thinking not just about, okay, where do we have connected low stress networks, which is great, but how do people use the transportation system, especially from a bicycling perspective? So keeping in mind these same kind of low stress facilities and taking into account research that comes out of Portland State that looks at what people's perceptions are when they're bicycling of the distance that they travel. And so you can see if you're traveling on a very high stress street, so that's that red arc there, it's a much longer perceived distance, and there's a lot of great research that kind of shows this difference, as opposed to if you're traveling on a very low stress street where you might actually believe the distance to be less. So over here on the right, you can kind of see, protected bike lane, maybe that's a 1, that's sort of a mile is a mile, whereas a buffered bike lane, actually, I think those should be reversed there, sorry, is a little less than 1, a bike boulevard also a little less than 1, and a path, a good deal less than 1. So you're traveling a mile, but you think you're traveling, 0.84 miles, right? That's kind of the concept there as it's applied. And so what we've done, and for those of you who've seen the Google Bike Network, the Google Bike Vision Plan, is do some analysis that essentially routes people through the network to understand how their level of stress impacts their likelihood of riding, essentially. And so, we have these very colorful maps, and there are a whole bunch of them, and there's more work related to this that we've been working on since then that starts to get at, how far out can you travel and have a low stress journey. And so we've looked at this in a variety of different ways. One simple way is this kind of total stress map. So it shows you, obviously, as you get further away, you have greater stress, right? There's just a function of distance being a big part of stress as a bicyclist because you're having to deal with some situations, even if they're relatively low stress. But then you can also look at the average stress. So given a point that you start from, is that stress kind of relatively less or more than other similarly distanced points, right? So normalizing it by distance. Or the other thing that we've done recently that we find very useful is to compare it, normalize it basically by the lowest possible stress. So let's say that route was a path the whole way with no interruptions, right? That would be the lowest stress route. So how would you make that comparison? And that's pretty helpful for sort of understanding where are there kind of pockets of people, especially for a project like this where you were looking at a specific destination or set of destinations where you could identify low stress networks, or with some project you could create low stress networks, and that would get a lot more people bicycling. Because there's very good kind of research that shows that if you have these lower stress networks, you'll get more people out there bicycling. So that's kind of the basic concept there, and the variety of different things. We also have maps that kind of show the routing algorithms and other kinds of things that we could share with you. And some of that is in your packet as part of that plan. And then the last thing I wanted to show quickly was just an example that we've done recently. This was actually adopted by the city of Cupertino last week, which we're very happy about. And it was to inform their most recent bicycle plan update. And essentially what we did was we looked at, for the existing network, how do you, if you pick a set of destinations, and the destinations were, some key employment centers, which you can probably imagine what those are, as well as kind of the civic center area, some of the neighborhood movements, and some of the most important kind of school-based movements. And you look at a map like this for each one and understand where are those pockets of high stress, where are the pockets of low stress, where, if we put some project in, would we be addressing, multiple different pockets of high stress, and that would allow you to sort of get your biggest bang for your buck in terms of making those improvements. So that's kind of some of the most recent research and efforts that are going on out there as they relate to bicycle and pedestrian comfort.
Great, thank you, everyone. We are available for questions, comments. Anyone that I introduced is available, so if you have a specific question, chances are we have someone who can answer it for you.
Great, thank you so much. This is a lot of information to go over, but I think it's really helpful for the commission and the city. Before we go to our own comments and questions, we have a public speaker.
Thank you. So we have a public speaker with a familiar name, Arthur Keller.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and commissioners. A couple of things to point out. So first of all, I'm not speaking on behalf of any official capacity. However, I will point out that at the most recent meeting of the Citizens Advisory Committee for the Comprehensive Plan, the voting members of the Citizen Advisory Committee did unanimously in a straw poll agree that we should retain vehicle level of service as part of the process of evaluating projects. So there was a motion to that effect, and then we also, in terms of retaining that as a policy, and then also with respect to a program, we wanted the thresholds to be updated. And I'm going to speak a little bit to the issue of thresholds. So one interesting thing is when I served on your body, and my colleagues then reviewed the Stanford Medical Center project to expand that. And one of the things that I was fascinated about was that most of the traffic impacts for Stanford Medical Center expansion were in Menlo Park, and very few of the impacts of traffic were in Palo Alto, which kind of flies in the face of expected reality. And that's because Menlo Park's LOS thresholds are much more strict than Palo Alto's LOS thresholds. We consider 4-second delay to be acceptable, while they consider 0.8-second delay to be acceptable. We basically talk about thresholds from changing from D to E and to F, well, as was mentioned in the materials, on many intersections they want D or even C on local intersections. So I think it makes sense to think about adopting the LOS thresholds for Menlo Park as we update our thresholds. And I think that this is a long time in coming because frankly, we should have had impacts of Stanford Medical Center expansion mean improvements to our Palo Alto streets, and that did not happen. I do understand that as was mentioned, the LOS is not going to be part of CEQA, so we will need a separate process for handling that. And I think that's worthwhile considering and how to do that. So I realize there's a study session, so you won't be considering this in terms of in particular detail in terms of proposals. But for thinking about how we integrate LOS into a development analysis project independent of CEQA is a worthwhile consideration.
I do think that that is a question that you may wish to ask of the presenters for the study session. Thank you for the opportunity to address you at this time, and I look forward to hearing this discussion and your deliberations. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Keller. I'd like to open it up for questions or comments from anyone up here. Commissioner Rosenblum.
First, just in the spirit of study session, I'm happy to learn more, so thank you. Question about VMT models. How mature are they? So I find VMT as a concept to be a little bit unintuitive, i.e. level of service is very easy for me to imagine that a project would or would not hit a certain threshold. So I can understand how many vehicles pump through a certain size road, can see the impact of that. VMT feels less intuitive, although I understand the concept of vehicle miles traveled. So I guess the question is, how do you validate and test, and how consistent are these models now? So has there been a coalescing of different cities around standard models, and has there been fairly good research to back up the validity of the model?
The simple answer is that we've had VMT being produced by travel forecasting models ever since the Clean Air Act. We need it for air pollution analysis, we need it for greenhouse gas analysis, and it's also the same models that produce the individual intersection volumes for level service analysis. So the models have been around a long time. What's happening with 743, they're being put under a spotlight asking those kinds of exact questions. How do we know if they're valid? What form of VMT are we looking at? Total VMT, VMT generated per capita. For the public, oftentimes if you talk about VMT, they don't have a point of reference. They know maybe how many miles they travel in their car in a given year. You know, I might travel 12,000 miles in a year. That's a point of reference, but a lot of the ways we express the metric in transportation planning or air quality analysis is a little bit of a foreign concept. So the models are valid, and in fact, if you think about what we have to do at the regional level with our models for air quality conformity, there have been a lot of rules and regulations about how we go about creating those models, putting them through testing to verify that they're actually valid for that purpose. But there are some changes. One of the things that the Governor's Office of Planning and Research has recommended in their guidelines is that when you analyze VMT for a land use project, for example, right here in Palo Alto, that you do what I would call a full accounting of the VMT, that you don't truncate trips at the edge of your political boundary. That tends to suggest we need to use regional models and track the trips to their endpoints. You could even go farther in that and say, well, a regional model has a boundary. The MTC model or the VTA model here have boundaries, and there are trips that cross over those boundaries into the valley, for example. So the CEQA purists and some of the lawyers will tell you, you better chase that trip even outside the model boundary if you're using a regional model. Those would be some of the questions that we'll end up debating. But I think you can be pretty certain that using a local city model that is literally has its limits at your political boundary, that would not be appropriate. It would tend to be too limiting in terms of keeping track of the full length of the trip.
So two quick follow-up questions. So first, could you just elaborate a little bit more on how the models are validated? So you made a statement, these models have been around for a long time, they have been validated. I'd love to just know how you actually validate. So what methodologies have been used? And then my second follow-up question, just to anticipate, is, and I don't know if you know the answer to this one, but someone say this table probably does. In Palo Alto, when we do VMT studies, do we end at our political boundary normally? But first question first. Okay.
Yeah, so when we validate a model, and I'm specifically talking about what I'm calling travel forecasting models. We have lots of models in the transportation planning, traffic engineering industry. And so when you think about level service, that's a traffic operations model. We actually use the travel forecasting model to come up with the traffic volumes that are used as inputs to the traffic operations model. So when we validate a travel forecasting model, there's a number of different tests we can do. I tend to break them up into two categories, what I'll call static tests. Those are statistical tests to compare the model's outputs to things we can go measure on the ground, a roadway traffic count, an intersection traffic count, and there should be a relatively close match. But we also have dynamic validation tests, and those are really more important because that's how we use models. We change the inputs and we expect an output change. And so we'll do certain testing, we'll increase land use, or we'll change a link in the network, we'll add lanes to it. And we expect the model to change in the appropriate direction and magnitude. So those are the two kind of basic tests. And whether or not you pass those tests depends on what the purpose is and what entity is governing that particular model. So here in California, one of the basic set of guidelines we use is the California Regional Transportation Plan Guidelines. Chapter 3 has complete model documentation on all the validation tests that are appropriate for regional models, and they extend those tests to local models, like your own city model or doing a model for a local project. Now, with regards to VMT, one of the benchmarks tends to be comparing the VMT results from a model to a database of VMT estimates that comes from the federal and state governments based on traffic counts. It's called the Highway Performance Monitoring System, HPMS for short. That's also just another model, though. So anytime you're comparing models, I get a little nervous. So one of the things we've started to do is use big data. We can actually use cell phone data, mobile device data, for example, to track you, all legally, by the way. There's a lot of privacy protection. And use that to verify trip lengths from particular origins or destinations. And you can get pretty accurate with that. You can get down to a 250-meter grid cell. So if you wanted to figure out, Trader Joe's, what's their typical trip length, we could figure that out. And VMT is simply a calculation, when you talk about an individual land use project, of trip generation multiplied by the trip lengths. So those are just some of the ways we go about the validation process. And I'll leave the question of Palo Alto specific to anybody else in the room that wants it.
Thank you for that question. We did, in the comp plan EIR, do an analysis of VMT, and our consultant used our model, which synced with the regional model. So it was looking at origins and destinations in the region to calculate the VMT attributable to our project.
So on a project level, when projects come before this body and we have to calculate impact, and there's a VMT study, then generally we would expect the standard to be used is regional?
I'm guessing yes, but we haven't crossed that bridge yet. I mean, we really haven't started doing this type of analysis on a project basis yet.
Okay. Yeah, those are my only questions for now. I'll wait to see if other colleagues have questions.
Thank you, Commissioner Rosenblum. Vice Chair.
Thank you. So this session is very, very useful because more we're going to talk, probably we're going to get to the enlightenment point. We're going to get to your level of understanding and expertise. So feel free just to, because there are so many experts in this room, so any comment from your side would be appreciated. So if we may maybe just broaden this session to be more interactive, that would be great. It would be better for this commission. I have a couple of questions. So I think that I'm just getting, after these comments, to the understanding that under CEQA, each project needs to consider options. So there is a possibility that under the traffic studies, there may be decision under CEQA to select some other option as opposed to the first one that was put on the table, because that VMT impact would be so great for the option number one that preferred option 3 would jump immediately to the top of the line. So it's I think that this is just I'm getting to the understanding. So and I see shaking heads, so that looks like yes, right?
If I could jump in and then hand it off to Ron. So currently, with a traffic impact analysis that's focused on just level of service, a project is conceived and planned and designed, and then the impacts to the roadway network are looked at, and there's mitigation measures that are, identified. I think with, the SB 743 changes, there's going to be more of an iterative process where, a project is conceived, you start to look at what the VMT generation is going to be, how long the trips are going to be, what the trip generation rate's going to be, and then there'll have to be a kind of a back and forth about design changes that can be made to the project. Are there, transit expansions that could be done, TDM programs, land use decisions that may need to be rethought in order to either reduce trip lengths or reduce the number of trips, coming and going and coming from that development.
Yeah, and there's a little bit of a nuance with CEQA as it relates to alternatives and also your requirements for mitigation. So if a project does have a significant VMT impact, what CEQA requires is you are obligated to mitigate to the extent feasible. Now, that to the extent feasible is typically at the discretion of the lead agency. You're the judge of what's feasible in your community. That can be challenged in court, and the lawyers could spend lots of time on that, but that's kind of the basic way it works. Also, if you have a significant impact and you're developing project alternatives, the idea of developing the alternatives is to eliminate or minimize those significant impacts. So it's very likely that in crafting new alternatives, if you know you have a significant VMT impact, you might want one of those alternatives to be maybe a different design or different land use concept that is specifically targeted at reducing VMT because it'll reduce the significant impact.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And another question from a yes, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one more thought on this issue. I just wanted to clarify that alternatives analysis is an important part of CEQA. It really comes into play when you have a significant impact, when you expect you're going to have a significant impact. So we will often do TIAs and have CEQA analysis conducted for projects that at the end of the day we discover we can mitigate the impacts. So you're not going to get to the level of significance where you would be forced in an EIR context to analyze alternatives. So kind of the first line of inquiry is around mitigation, and then you get to the alternatives question.
Of course, I totally understand this, but then just giving the project that we were just looking into, Facebook expansion, having this residential development in some other area, you would potentially find that this would create large impact from VMT perspective, and for this reason, you may suggest locating this campus expansion in a different area. That would be significant change, right?
Yeah, certainly with a project of that scale, alternatives are an important inquiry.
So a question from a different perspective. Understanding VMT and how you're tracking this, is there a correlation with the desire to start taxing the car trips based on the mileage, knowing that there is a declining revenue from the taxation on gasoline? Is there a correlation between these two?
There's a correlation. It's not direct. You have the challenge of the gas tax being a declining revenue source because of improved mileage and how it hasn't been adjusted for inflation. And so a VMT or a road user charge has been in consideration. In fact, there's a pilot test going on here in California right now. And so it is related in that there is kind of this objective at the state level to reduce VMT. And the idea is if you reduce VMT, you achieve lots of different goals. You reduce greenhouse gases, you reduce air pollutants, you reduce the cost of traveling, you potentially reduce the impact to pavement, you potentially reduce the level of congestion that would otherwise occur if there's less people out driving around. So it's all related from the high-level state policies, but how VMT is actually being used can be very different depending on the purpose. Even in something as simple as an EIR, I mentioned there's now going to be 4 sections of an EIR that has to use VMT, the energy, greenhouse gases, air quality, and transportation. Right now, we actually analyze VMT differently in the greenhouse gas section than we do in the air pollution section, depending on the pollutant. If you're worried about carbon monoxide, we actually look at that right around intersections and sensitive receptors. We don't look at the regional VMT like we would for greenhouse gases. So depending on what you're doing, there's lots of ways to analyze VMT, and it may even be expressed in a different form. Like I said, VMT per capita or per service population, lots of different ways you might use it.
Yeah, thank you. And the last question relates to the use of those 2 measures. How suspecting that we may recommend retaining and using both for some period of time, how one would translate to the other one?
Yeah, now that's a really good question because they measure 2 different things. Vehicle level service is measuring traffic operations, and it's largely measured from the driver's perspective. You have to remember that. That's the focus. It doesn't tell you anything about the bicyclists or the pedestrians and what they're perceiving as they travel across the network. And VMT, you can think of it as more of an efficiency metric, especially if it's expressed as VMT per capita. You can compare different geographic areas and tell something about how much they have to travel by vehicle. And so it's measuring something very different, and it's directly related also to the air pollutants and greenhouse gases. But when you think about having both metrics and putting it in the context of a city, you have to think about your community values. And if you think about your general plan, the goals and the policies in that plan, they're an expression of your community values. What are you trying to create? What are you trying to protect? What are you trying to avoid? And where does vehicle level service rank in terms of your values versus VMT reduction? Which one ranks highest? Because if one outranks the other, then when you set thresholds, it has to be quite clear which one wins if there's competition or a conflict. In fact, our general plans have to be internally consistent. So you couldn't pick two different thresholds that actually competed. You need to resolve that at the general plan level, so when individual projects come in, it's quite clear whether or not they're going to have an impact or not. And what happens in a lot of communities is it comes down to where does the value of driving really fit within the community. Some communities are much more spread out. They're very dependent on being able to get around an automobile, and the value they place on vehicle level service will be much higher. Other places would like to have more travel choices. They tend to be more compact. They tend to be more urban, more dense. You have more travel choices, and so they might lean towards VMT reduction being a more important goal. And there's not one size fits all in a state as big as California. And that's one of the challenges that OPRs run into in putting out a threshold guidance recommendation that says 15% below the existing VMT per capita. That's tough if you don't have those travel choice options because land uses are spread far apart or you don't have the bus service to connect you.
Right, and I understand this goal of 15% reduction, but observing traffic increase and congestion in the Bay Area, it's no-brainer to us, right? That keeps increasing, going up and up. So that is, I just may be, hopeful but very skeptical about achieving this reduction, because given the population growth, Facebook expansion, and further development in all the adjacent municipalities, I can see that pretty much the traffic will be constantly increasing, regardless of this 15% goal reduction.
If I could just jump in and address the earlier point. One of the other things that the OPR guidance includes is a requirement to analyze induced demand. And so there's a large body of evidence that shows that, the easier it is for folks to drive, the longer distances they'll travel and the more often they'll drive. So there could be a direct, an inverse correlation between, making improvements related to improving the level of service and an increase in VMT. Because the easier you make it for people to, travel during the peak hour, the more likely they are to use a motor vehicle to make a trip that they may use another mode for. So I don't know, Rana, you want to talk a little bit about the induced demand guidelines?
It's a topic that came up not just through OPR but through Caltrans. So we just finished a white paper for Caltrans. They're rewriting all of their transportation analysis guidance right now, including their transportation impact study guidelines for purposes of CEQA compliance. That's something that I'm directly working on. And the induced travel, there's a white paper, it's published now, it's available through their website, and we can share that with you if you want to get into the details. But Josh is right, that basically, especially in urban congested areas, it's very difficult to add any kind of roadway supply or make some type of modification to the network that would lower travel times that wouldn't just induce new traffic that would fill that space back up. And it used to be, in looking at older research, it would take a few years for the new lanes to fill up, a combination of population and employment growth plus existing people just making more trips. But if you followed some of the news, the 405 HOV lane in Southern California, Katy Freeway in Texas, I think it's I-25 in Denver, some of these projects are now filling up in 1 or 2 years because there's that much latent demand that wants to get out there and drive if you make it easier to drive. So that is a consideration, and OPR makes it pretty clear in their guidance that if you are building what they call a general purpose lane on a freeway or a major arterial, that those are the types of projects likely to have a significant impact. But they also acknowledge that transit, bike, and ped projects are likely not to have significant impacts. So that helps in those places that want to pursue the active transportation projects. But the bar is going to be held a little bit higher on those bigger freeway or roadway projects. The other context that we've worked with Caltrans on is whether you're in the Bay Area or Southern California, you'll hear typically congestion is a problem. And I'm not going to disagree with that, but I would append it to say congestion is a problem, but it's also a symptom of poor seat utilization caused by the fact that we don't price travel. You know, we basically have every morning and evening peak period where we have our roadway system oversubscribed by folks because the cost of travel just isn't high enough to avoid that peak. The only real pricing we have is, I'll call it shadow pricing. It's the travel time penalty you have to experience if you decide to travel in the peaks. And if you look at our freeway system, we don't utilize it very, very well. That seat utilization issue is a really big deal because we have thousands of empty seats every morning and evening. So if you filled up the seats, you wouldn't have the congestion problem or the degradation in travel flow that we experience. So for agencies like Caltrans that own and operate a big state highway system, those are some of the questions they're facing is, do we continue to expand the system, which is expensive, has environmental impacts and other issues, or do we find a way to take advantage of the system we've already built and just operate it, in a wiser way?
Right. Thank you very much for your time. And I see that my colleagues have questions, but before I just give up my microphone, I remember, and this is exactly in regards to the comment that you made, I still remember the comment that back then our chairman, Greg Tanaka, made when we were reviewing a TMA program that was aiming 30% reduction, where he requested to change the objective of this program to incentive from perspective as opposed to restriction. And that was the perception of the Commission, that we believe that it's better to incentivize or create incentives to change from the car to other modes of transportation as opposed to restrict folks, because that may not be the right way of resolving things. And thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Commissioner Waldfogel, I think you were next.
Thank you. Thank you for the report. This raises a lot of interesting questions and ideas, but what I'd really like to get at is I think there's a sense among residents in the community that their subjective experience with travel, whether it's local travel or regional travel, is a lot worse than the data reflects. I mean, I know that if I want to get to San Francisco for 7 p.m., I leave at 4:30 now instead of 5:30. Or getting across town at 5 p.m. can be an interesting project. And we all wear different hats. I mean, sometimes we're cyclists, sometimes we're pedestrians, sometimes we're drivers. It depends on the mission. It depends on the task at hand. It depends on the urgency. I think what's missing in this is we need to find a way to explain to the community what are reasonable expectations over the next 10 years. I can't really read into this. I understand that under CEQA, we'll pivot to VMT. Clearly, we'll do that. We'll probably retain LOS in some other frameworks. But I don't think the community has a good sense of what the experience will be if you live in, pick your favorite street and you need to, commute to work or go to the supermarket or go to San Francisco or any of these missions. What are reasonable expectations? So how do we communicate that? Because it's really hard for me to look at this. This is a big stack of documents, a lot of really good science. And I don't want to get into the situation of saying, what do I believe? The science or my lying eyes. But, what's your sense about how we talk about this so that we don't have 10 or 15 years of regret, remorse, disappointment? We don't have people saying, oh, look, we've approved 77 projects and the cumulative impact was supposed to be minimal, but in fact it's, if you look at the actual data from 2000 versus 2016, the cumulative impact is ginormous. So how do we actually do this in a way that captures experience? So I don't know who wants to touch that one.
I'll start, and I think Hillary will probably want to jump in too. I think without a doubt, we can say that we experience congestion in Palo Alto, especially during the peak hour. I think the rapidity of the increase in congestion is really what is frustrating people. Areas that have been congested for long periods of time, decades, I think people grow more accustomed to congestion and they find alternative means to move around. I think we have folks in the community that remember when it was relatively easy to get around, and we didn't have the economic growth and the robust economy that we have today. I mean, congestion at the end of the day is really related to economic growth.
But doesn't that say that we have unmitigated impact, or is that just something that we should have expected along the way? I mean, I think that's where the gap is, because I think we're all admitting that the experience is worse now than it used to be. But is that something that should have been mitigated along the way, and we need to go back and fix that? Or do we just say, hey, we just should have understood that's what would happen?
I don't think it's a uniquely Palo Alto situation. I think the whole Bay Area right now is struggling with, massive amounts of freeway and surface street congestion, more so than, people experienced, even a decade ago. It's directly related to the growth in the economy. I think we need to start to, measure the expectations a little bit. And I don't think, outside of some great economic shift that we're going to see immediate congestion relief and we're going to be able to go back to a place where people no longer, are concerned about congestion.
But how do we tell this to people? I mean, if the reasonable expectation is that between now and 2040, sort of given levels of road investment, transit investment, economic growth, et cetera, that it'll take, in 2040, it'll take 2 hours to get across town or 4 hours to get to San Francisco, basically to be faster to walk than to drive. I mean, if that's where we're headed, how do we depict that to people so people can make rational choices?
So I think, if that is where we're headed, we need to really start to think about what are the impacts to neighborhoods. Are we experiencing regional traffic on local neighborhoods? Is that something we focus on, trying to stem that growth? Do we start to really provide travel alternatives for people that are realistic? Transit and active transportation, and a lot of us.
But that's great. But I mean, we're like $2 billion behind regionally on transit investment, and we can't fix that on an agency basis. Probably more than $2 billion. So I'm just sort of saying, what I'm trying to drive at is sort of what do we do? I mean, how do we set expectations so 5 years from now, whoever happens to be sitting on this commission isn't getting. Basically isn't getting a bunch of people with, spears, demanding redress.
Maybe I can chime in. I mean, I guess I've been, doing this for a long time now, and I have been working professionally in the Bay Area through several economic cycles. It's been so long, and I remember, for example, when I started working in San Francisco, we were using an office employment density of about 235 square feet per employee. I mean, it was boom times in San Francisco. And then we went into an economic downturn, and it became quite defensible, even kind of optimistic to be using an employment office density of about 310 square feet per employee. So that was a change in probably, I don't know, the first 5 or 6 years of my professional career in San Francisco. And that just shows you how big an economic swing can be. And I think the same is true in traffic. I think if I look forward 40 years, I'm expecting that between now and the 40-year period, we're going to see ups and downs. We're going to see periods where traffic is not as bad as it is now. We're going to see periods where traffic is worse. In some periods, we're going to see lengthening the peak. So that horrible congestion that drives you nuts in the rush hour is not just going to be the rush hour, but it's going to be the shoulders of the rush hour. But that there are going to be other times and other changes in the way we work and the way we think about travel and time of day and all that stuff that will result in other changes. So. And that's, with or without additional square footage, additional population. I think these changes are so related to the economic cycles that and how we how we work and, kind of when we make our trips, that it's going to fluctuate over time.
Yeah, well, and I don't want to battle that. This is really just a point that we need to find language, non-technical language, that we can use to explain to people what are reasonable expectations. And I think that's something that's really been missing from this process. I mean, we have this great technical document that describes, we've seen numerous traffic studies, intersection studies. And we have other phenomena going on, like Waze, which is moving traffic off arterials onto side streets, and we could have a policy debate about whether that's a good idea or a bad idea, but it's a fact. And I just get the sense that there's a disconnect between what the technical traffic community is doing and what the public perceives. And this study session should be an opportunity to close that gap, and I welcome just some thoughts on that.
Yeah, you've hit on a topic that is resonating not just here in California, but around the country. The expectation that we continue to run into in most urban areas is travel time reliability. People are willing to accept, okay, better economy, there's going to be some congestion, but I need to plan my day. I need to plan my schedule. I need to get my kids to school or to soccer practice. I need to get to work or an important meeting, and I need to understand what my travel choices are, and I need to understand the reliability. So that puts it back on the technical folks like myself to think about, well, how can we do that? And when we think about that, it is through better data, through better models, which we do have access to, but it's also part of the conversation you have when you do your general plan updates. Going back to the expectations, what are the expectations for what travel markets you want to serve? Do you want to serve people just moving around Palo Alto? Do you want to be able to serve people that want to go from Palo Alto to San Francisco? A lot of the way level service analysis has worked up to this point is we chase bottlenecks. We look at an intersection, it's congested, we try to fix the intersection. We never stop to ask the question, who's traveling through that intersection? Who do we want to prioritize traveling through that intersection? Should we prioritize the bikes getting through the intersection or the cars? So what's happening in a lot of communities now is they're asking those kinds of expectation questions. Who do we expect to serve? And what should they expect in terms of reliability in their travel day so they can appropriately schedule?
So to not beat a dead horse, I think if there are technical ways to capture those ideas about reliability and maybe feed those into this process, I think that would be incredibly helpful. I don't know whether LLS or VMT or something else is the right way to think about it.
Yeah, it tends to be travel time related. In fact, Caltrans has something called the Smart Mobility Framework. They're actually doing a learning network this year. They're going around to their different districts and teaching people about what that particular process looks like. But instead of looking at just vehicle level service, they look at 6 different principles, including equity, the environment, the economy, and trying to look at all those things that are important to communities. And travel time reliability is one of the calculations you can do. And you can do that for the city residents, you could do that for the employees, you could do that for the region. There's lots of different ways to break that up.
Yeah, and that doesn't have to be biased by modality. But anyhow, just please consider thinking about those kind of metrics.
Certainly. I neglected to mention at the opening that we're taking all of this feedback and we're going to be going to City Council in September with the same presentation, so we can certainly incorporate any ideas you have as to how to have that discussion at Council as well.
There's one kind of tangentially related topic that I wanted to make sure we raise, which is, we have actually funded in last year's budget an update to the Nexus study that helps us establish a transportation impact fee. So we have several impact fees that apply to different areas of Palo Alto. We're trying to simplify that a little, but also update the fees. And it's an opportunity because this whole world of methodology and different types of analyses is changing. It's an opportunity for us to think about what we want those fees to address. What are the impacts that we're really trying to address, and whether we want to focus our program on traffic calming, on the experiential aspect of this that you're raising. And I think that's going to be a really interesting line of inquiry as we go forward to start the study.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Tanaka.
So thank you for this update. Actually, in general, I think this seems to be heading in the right direction. It seems like it's considering more of the factors, and while not perfect, I think it is definitely better. I do have a few questions, which is So my colleague asked about kind of like the models you guys are using, and you kind of explained about that. But one thing you didn't talk about that I was interested in is, and I like how you guys are actually measuring against reality, which is I think is a really good policy. But can you speak about what are the error rates you get? Like how different is the model from actual reality? Can you speak about, how accurate are the models and, because I rarely see like the error rates reported. I see what the models say, but rarely what actually is the reality.
So I give you a warning. I don't want to scare you, but when we talk about travel forecasting models, it's very difficult to forecast the future. If you just watch the news and look at the Fed and their ability to forecast, economic growth, it's a challenge, and we deal with much longer time frames. So the general accuracy has to be viewed from the lens of what do we want the model to do? If the model is helping us to decide, do we need to build 2 lanes, 4 lanes, or 6 lanes 20 years in the future, we can have quite a bit of level of error. You could be as high as 20 or 30% and still not make a laneage error. But that also has to be thought about in the context of the performance metric. If you're talking about VMT, which is a pretty aggregate measure, you also want to think to the future and understand, well, how much variation could there be in the future? So we've done one particular analysis that looks at the variation in VMT per capita over the next through 2040. The range is about 8,000 to 18,000 VMT per capita. That's how big the range is without the city doing anything with land use or transportation. That's some of the things that we just heard about in terms of the economic differences, the disruptive forces of technology and the millennials and aging population. Lots of things are going to happen outside your control that's going to change VMT per capita quite dramatically. So when we think about these models and we think about accuracy, those are the kinds of things we look at. And when we look at what the statistics are in terms of validation, you'll typically see things in the range of plus or minus 10% when you're looking at large order facilities like a freeway or an arterial. But it tends to fluctuate with volume. We do not want a 20% error on a freeway facility carrying 100,000 vehicles a day. If I've got a road carrying 1,000 vehicles a day, I could be off by 100%, and it's not going to make that much difference because it's only going to be a 2-lane road. So we have to think about it in that kind of context.
I see. Well, I mean, to me, if you're making you have a 10 or even 20% error 10 years from now or 20 years from now, that's pretty good. I mean, just in terms of forecasting, am I hearing that right or am I getting it wrong?
If you want to think about it in terms of years, we have one researcher, a gentleman by the name of Robert Bain, that used to work for Standard & Poor's. He evaluated toll road projects around the world, including transit projects. And he did before and after studies. And he isolated the U.S. We spent some time working with him to look specifically at U.S. projects. And he did create a little formula that tells you how much error you can expect in a small area forecast. Small area would be like the city of Palo Alto. And when you go out 25 years, it's plus or minus 40%. If you're only going out 10 years, yeah, you're probably closer to that 15 to 20% range. But remember, it's plus or minus. And so when this is also important when you think about the impact studies you currently look at when you look at level service. You'll oftentimes see intersection analysis in like the year 2040 as part of the cumulative analysis. Someone had to actually forecast the left turn volume at that intersection. Frankly, we're not that good. When it comes to an intersection, if it's 2 4-lane roads that cross each other, we'd probably recommend reserve right-of-way to build 2 lefts, 2 throughs, and a right. But telling you in the year 2040 there's only going to be 150 left turns, and so you only have to build 1 lane, that's not something we do it in practice because agencies require it, but it's not something that we're really, you should think the models are actually that accurate.
If I could jump in. I think it's important to realize that traffic is not a naturally occurring phenomena. It's all a result of land use decisions that are made and development that's occurring. So the models are predicting traffic based on historic land development patterns and how Americans travel and how Bay Area residents travel. All of those things can be manipulated through land use decisions and planning decisions that communities make. So I don't want it to seem like it's some fixed. The model is doing its best based on historic patterns of growth.
Okay. But anyways, it gives me confidence that it's not too far off, at least from what I'm hearing. I guess the second question is, and I'm just thinking about my own usage of my car, which is actually dropping, right? Because I bike a lot now, or for instance, if I go to the airport, I would take Uber or Uber pool, so share the car with other people, or if I go to the city, I might actually do things like Lux, where they do valet parking, right? It's kind of like anywhere in the city. And what I wonder is, on the more distant horizon, you have things like autonomous cars. And I wonder how is that, if we're looking at 10, 20 years, how are what's the current thought process around, how is this going to be changing traffic?
That's a very astute question with regards to VMT. So there has been research on it. And what we know about if there is autonomous vehicles, it will increase VMT. And that would be something outside your land use or transportation controls in a typical city. That's something the market's going to deliver. But it basically reduces the cost of driving. You don't have to pay attention, so you can do something else. And what all of our research tells us is that leads to people being willing to make more trips or longer distance trips. The other thing we have is if they're delivered through transportation network companies, the way Uber and Lyft work today, we're going to have a phenomenon that I call simultaneous trip generation. I did it the other day in DC, where I ordered Uber Eats at the same time that I ordered an Uber to come pick me up because I was going to take the food with me to a different destination. So I generated 2 trips that I wasn't in the vehicle. And then I got into the vehicle and made a 3rd trip, all in a very short period of time. So if you own your own car, you're only going to be making those trips with you in the car. TNCs, autonomous vehicles, all have the potential to increase the amount of VMT, even if they reduce the number of vehicles on the road. So it's a difference between vehicles on the road versus the number of trips and the total VMT we generate.
So I don't know if any of you have had the honor of seeing Stefan Heck's presentation. It's absolutely amazing. He talks a lot about the transition period and when the ultimately we're going to get to a point where we have, autonomous electric shared vehicles. But there's going to be a transition period, I think, where we may see an increase in trips and an increase in VMT, where we have, folks that own their own autonomous vehicles. They're not sharing them. They may be driving around while somebody's at a meeting. We're also going to have to think about what impacts it's going to have on parking eventually when we get to that mode. So I think we're at a real watershed moment when we start talking about the future of transportation, and a lot of the folks in our field are really kind of uncertain where that's going to take us. There are arguments that will increase VMT. There are arguments that will quickly adapt a shared autonomous shared model of vehicles where multiple people are using the same vehicle at the same time throughout the day, and the vehicle doesn't need to be stored. So we then have to look at what our minimum parking requirements may need to be. So I think we'd be remiss if we didn't think about that and when it's going to come. Stefan Heck predicts in 2020 or the years shortly after that. A lot of folks are saying 2030, a little bit after that, but that's all within the horizon of, the planning that we're doing today.
One last question, which is, so with these changes, especially like with the VMT change, is this supported by all the software packages that the city's using? And are we, do our systems support these kind of measures?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
Well, so for instance, the move towards VMT versus LOS, do the current software packages that we use, is this supported? How is our software?
So if I could just say, we have a city travel demand model that will actually generate VMT, for the city as a whole. I think Hillary can talk about how we exported that to the model used for the comp plan.
Yeah, no, we use that model for the comp plan, and they built some connection to the regional model for outside that the focused area. And so they use that to calculate VMT. I think a larger question is, when we get to the point where we're doing these VMT calculations and comparing to a threshold for smaller projects than a citywide plan, what does that look like? How are we going to, over the next 2 years, transition to an organization, like everyone will have to, that finds a more cost-effective, faster way to do that analysis for even smaller projects, and what does that look like?
Yeah, I wonder if Ron could talk about whether anyone is looking at just establishing kind of VMT generation rates by land use, or outside of running a model for every single project. Is there some kind of formula that could be used for single family residential or
There are simplified models that do that now. And so the point that Hillary's making is you're going to have to decide, when you come up with your threshold, that's one of the first questions you're going to ask yourself, what's the methodology we're using? Because if you're using the regional model, the OPR guidance says whatever model you use to set your threshold is the same model you should use to analyze the project so you get apples to apples. And that can be a pretty daunting task because what OPR seems to be suggesting is, hey, regional models are probably best because they capture more of the total travel. They don't truncate the trips at the political boundaries. But just to run, for example, the MTC model, we're doing some project analysis right now. We have 40 hours, Robert? 40 hours to do a run. Versus the simple model we have, which is also a very accurate model that is in compliance with CEQA in terms of substantial evidence to support the trip generation and the trip lengths. We can run that in about 15 minutes. So you're going to have to make some decisions between the 15-minute models and the 40-minute or the 40-hour models, and it's going to come down to, what are you trying to capture when you look at VMT? What do you want to understand about the potential impacts? We did a project recently in Davis, California, where they wanted a research and development project to be put on around the edge of the city as an incubator for UC Davis. And if we had run just one of the simple models, we could have told you in 15 minutes what the VMT of that particular project is. It wouldn't have told you anything about what the VMT for the community is and how it changes that. And by putting a bunch of jobs in Davis where they have no new housing, actually is a worse situation from a VMT standpoint. We would actually have to run the regional model to demonstrate that. So if you're worried about the total VMT effect on the community, then yes, using a regional model makes sense. If you just need to isolate what the project's generating, you can do that with these simpler tools.
Commissioner Downing.
So I actually wanted to follow up on that. And I was wondering if there is any published guidance with regard to those thresholds. Like if you're looking at an apartment complex, 100 units, for example, what do you expect to happen to the VMT? What are sort of reasonable guidelines for areas like Palo Alto and our neighboring cities? Do we have any models for that yet?
Well, you do. You have the first recommendation from OPR, which for a residential project is a 15% reduction below baseline for VMT per capita. So you'd measure the VMT per capita for the existing residents, and you would expect that the apartment project to perform at least 15% better than that project. But as I said earlier, your general plan already has a VMT threshold baked into it if you think about this. Let's say that project comes in, it's consistent with your general plan, and it's consistent with your zoning. So it's part of the VMT you've already anticipated. You could even extend that argument to say that, well, the regional models were based off your general plan to a large degree. And so that project and in that location was part of the regional modeling for air quality conformity, for SB 375, which is our greenhouse gas reduction targets for the regional agencies. You could make the argument that that project's also part of the regional solution to achieve air quality conformity and meet the greenhouse gas reductions. The question then becomes, do you want to expect that project to perform any better than what you've already baked into the general plan and baked into that regional transportation plan? And the one reason that you might, there's more, but there's one important one, that most of the modeling done at the regional scale and at your local general plan scale, those models don't build TDM into them. So there are additional strategies you could add to a project as mitigation that would lower its VMT compared to what you'd get from just land use and transportation inputs that are typically analyzed in the model.
So if I could walk you back a little bit. So you talked about, for residential, for example, lowering VMT by 15% per capita. But who are you looking at for that? I mean, if the project doesn't exist, so 100 people aren't there, and then tomorrow they are there, so how are you doing that calculation?
Yeah, so if you want to follow the OPR guidance, they're suggesting you measure the existing VMT per capita for the existing residents in the city. And you can compare to the city VMT per capita, or you can compare to the region VMT per capita. They've given you both options. And there's different ways of doing that depending on the models you use. You can even use that big data. If you want to actually compare to other apartment projects in Palo Alto, we could go order up some cell phone data and go out and put some traffic counters around the apartments, and we could tell you how many trips they generate and how far those trips go. And you could compare then to existing apartment projects if you wanted to.
Okay, so are you comparing the VMT per capita for the entire city versus the VMT per capita of the people who would live in the project?
Yes.
Is that?
Yes.
Okay. All right, I just want to make sure I understand.
And the 15% reduction is based on greenhouse gas emission goals in the state plan, correct?
More or less, yeah. So if you followed SB 375, what the state did with 375 was to say for the land use and transportation sector, greenhouse gas reductions that we expect, we delegate that to the MPOs because it's really hard for the state to figure out. And the MPOs here in the Bay Area, for example, MTC, they've largely adopted about a 15% reduction. AB 32 recommended about a 15% reduction. There is new information out of ARB that's suggesting that 15% reduction, if you go all the way out to 2050, you may even need a little bit more than the 15%. But that's kind of where it's coming from. Caltrans has also recommended a 15% reduction in VMT per capita as part of the strategic plan that they just prepared and released back in March.
Okay, so I think I want to poke at the practicalities a little bit. Okay, so let's say we have a project. We've done the calculation. It doesn't reduce by 15%. Let's say it reduces by 13%. What can the project do at that point to fix that?
Right. I'll let Sarah answer that. Sarah's done a lot of our TDM work and looking at specific strategies that work like best in the Bay Area. So one of the challenges with TDM is there's lots of different strategies, but they're not always transferable. The work that like Robert and I are doing right now for Stanford, those are pretty unique and they won't work just anywhere. So Sarah, why don't you give her an idea?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are a range of TDM strategies. Of course, as Palo Alto Planning Commissioners, you're familiar with what goes on at Stanford and some of the larger employers in the area. For residential projects specifically, some of the most effective strategies are pricing parking. So what you can do is you can require that people rent a parking space or a second parking space separately from the rent on their apartment. You can also do a targeted outreach program. So Portland has been very successful with its Smart Trips program, which is cost about $10 per capita to do outreach in targeted neighborhoods, getting people to be aware of the different alternatives they have and actually doing some social encouragement and competition around using active transportation like biking and walking and using transit. You can also incentivize the use of transit. So one strategy that's becoming increasingly popular is buying passes for Caltrain or VTA for an entire apartment complex. Caltrain and VTA have been doing that for years with employers, and so a lot of large employers, including Stanford, might provide discounted passes for employees. That's now becoming possible at the residential complex level as well. So in addition to all those strategies that you see happening at employers, you can also do stuff residentially. And so what all that means is you're basically shifting people's travel from driving to using other modes, and that's going to reduce VMT. There's a lot of different ways to quantify that. There are several different models. There's the Cal-E model. We have an in-house model that we helped to develop for the Bay Area Air Quality Management District. And all of those estimates of VMT reduction resulting from TDM strategies are based on peer-reviewed research and typically calibrated to local or regional conditions.
Okay.
Well, I think we're also going to have to start talking about design of particular projects. Maybe it may be appropriate to include a corner store or something, or a dry cleaner or something that's going to eliminate the need for somebody to use a motor vehicle to make an everyday errand. Walkability to and from the site. The surrounding roadway network could definitely have an influence too. If it's along a major arterial that's difficult to cross to get to transit, you're probably not going to see the kind of transit use that you may need to achieve that 15% reduction.
Okay. And then if I could also ask you what that might look like for a commercial project. Let's say it's a building, 1 floor retail, 3 floors office. What do VMT guidelines generally look like for our area for that?
In terms of the VMT guidelines, or in terms of how you would try to reduce VMT once you establish what reduction you're getting?
What would we consider acceptable thresholds?
Okay, I'm going to let Ron answer that one.
For the city of Palo Alto, we haven't really gotten to the point where we've thought about thresholds. I think Ron can talk about what other communities may have adopted.
Yeah,
that's what I'm looking
for mixed-use projects, OPR is applying the same 15% reduction, and they've suggested, though, that you break out that by land use. So you look at the residential separately from the office. We've suggested that you might actually want to look at the mixed-use project in its entirety because you want to make sure you don't dilute the benefits of putting the mix of uses together. So that's one of the things that OPR is currently considering a potential change to, is at least looking at the mixed-use project in its entirety. And then in terms of a local threshold, one of the other things that you're going to want to think about is, to the extent that you've already made decisions about greenhouse gases or air pollution in terms of what kind of threshold you've set for those, there's a mobile emissions component of that that's tied to VMT in most cases. And one of the things that's a little bit challenging for some cities that have already adopted like climate action plans, and they've put very specific greenhouse gas reduction thresholds in there, they never thought that there'd be a new law that come along and would use VMT as a threshold. And those agencies are finding, wow, we want to be really aggressive on greenhouse gases. And we could be, because there's a lot of things you can do to, like I said earlier, to offset that without having to change the project. It's someone paying money typically. In the transportation section, there's not offsets. It's change the project or add that TDM program. It usually means more costs. So if you do have things like greenhouse gas or air pollution reduction targets already, you want to make sure you understand the connection to VMT that's already embedded in those thresholds or objectives.
Yeah, I just had a thought to add on that, and this is really not something that I've had the opportunity to think about a lot, but I wanted to point out that here in Palo Alto, all areas are not created equal. I mean, we may have an opportunity over the next 2 years as we start to develop our thresholds and our methodology for analyzing projects using the new metrics, to think about areas like downtown and our more walkable neighborhoods in a different way than we think about development that happens in areas that are not as transit accessible and that don't have the mix of services. Our current comp plan, the comp plan that was adopted in 1998, really has a strong flavor of walkable neighborhoods. We saw the transition to mixed-use zoning districts, and all of the mixed-use districts that are in our zoning code is a reflection of that kind of policy direction in the last comprehensive plan. And I think we can start to think about our city in that way as we figure out how to assess VMT and potentially think about different neighborhoods differently.
Yeah, and I think this was kind of the last thing that I wanted to talk about. So, the way that you talked about doing the VMT comparisons, right? Taking the per capita of the city and then comparing it to the VMT of the project. It's kind of a very static way of looking at it, right? Because in reality, the project itself changes what the rest of the community does, right? So, like, let's say you build an office building, right? And let's say, we make assumptions that most of these people are coming from out of Palo Alto. Okay, so now suddenly the building looks really bad from a VMT perspective. But on the other hand, if the building is replacing something ugly and run down on El Camino, which I could point to 20, right, it makes that area suddenly a little bit more walkable, right? It makes it nicer, right? It increases the chances of people walking there, biking there, feeling safer there, right? If they add in some portion of retail, that reduces VMT for the rest of the city. And so I'm just wondering how these kind of, to me, these things kick off feedback loops, and I kind of wonder how you make sure that you're taking those into account.
Yeah, you're bringing up a point that is a big difference between looking at the project myopically versus looking at it in the community setting or the neighborhood setting. Now, one of my favorite examples is Trader Joe's. If you look at a Trader Joe's by itself, it's got new trips coming to it, it's going to generate new VMT. But if I put that Trader Joe's into what I'm going to call a food desert, where it's nothing but residential, and they have to drive 7 miles to the nearest grocery store, if I measure the market area for Trader Joe's, that neighborhood, the VMT per capita for the neighborhood probably went down. Mm-hmm. So it depends on how you measure it and what kind of story are you telling. And in the context of CEQA, I would prefer to tell a very complete story. As full disclosure, that yes, the Trader Joe's, if I look at it myopically, does generate 10,000 VMT, whatever the number is. But I'm also going to measure that at the community scale and measure, what did it do to my community? Did it make it more efficient? Because VMT per capita is actually going to go down because I didn't have the grocery store in close proximity where people live.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
So I'm going to take around and then pass it back to you all. Thank you everyone for these very detailed reports. I think it's very helpful to us all. It just shows us how much more complex the world is getting and how much more work you all are going to have to do. But it is exciting, and it is actually nice to see that the state is able to attain some of its greenhouse gas goals and trip reduction goals through this new plan a little bit. That's nice to see. I'm really interested in this idea of kind of layering with VMT, and maybe get part of the way there with your transportation planning, maybe get part of the way there with the land use, maybe a bit of it's with TDM. And Commissioner Downing was touching on this. I'm wondering, Are any cities so far reacting in their zoning to this change? And if so, how? And how they're actually like implementing it, making amendments there?
Both in the general plan and zoning. In fact, one of the first jurisdictions to deal with VMT as a threshold was Yolo County, of all places. And they did it for a kind of unique reason. They said, this is back when the Attorney General's office was actually legally challenging cities and counties over not having climate action plans. They were doing their general plan update. And they wanted assurances in the general plan and a follow through to even zoning that new growth areas would be designed for low VMT and therefore low greenhouse gases. So what they ended up in the general plan was a VMT threshold, 44 VMT generated per household per weekday, that a new growth area had to be designed to. They also followed that up in the land use section and said you need to have a jobs housing balance and a jobs housing match. The wages of the house, the wages of the workers have to match the prices of the houses, so we get a connection there. We don't want to see just jobs housing balance because we may not have that match. They also set minimum density of 8 units per acre. That tends to create a more walkable environment. They also limited the roads to 2 lanes in the center of the new development and allowed level service F. You couldn't have 4-lane roads, for example. So we are seeing some more aggressive treatments that are starting the general plan and then trickling down into how they handle the zoning when it's that important of an objective to the community. And this goes back to what I said earlier, where does VMT reduction or greenhouse gas reduction fit within all those different community values? And if it's at the top of the list, yeah, you're probably going to see it show up in your general plan and in your zoning.
Right. No, that's really helpful. Thank you so much. Just a few comments for the city. I think Commissioner Rosenblum brought this up pretty well in terms of how do you validate what the reduction is. As the city builds this out, we should consider is 15% good enough for Palo Alto? Or as Hillary, as you mentioned, do you want to make it neighborhood by neighborhood, right? Maybe downtown and Cal Ave, it's higher than that. The other question is a little bit less about VMT, and it's about some of the other parts of this presentation. I was wondering, how can Palo Alto validate and potentially incorporate some of the more active mode methodologies? So I was really interested in like the stress model that was that map of Google, and like why are parts of Palo Alto green and other parts not? Are we looking at anything there?
So we have been working with Google on that plan, and they're actually they're trying to advance a grant program where they would actually fund closing some of the gaps that are identified in their vision plan. That's the vision plan was kind of the first step. If you remember, they actually funded the concept planning for 4 of our bike boulevards, and those were funded by Google because they saw those as specific gaps in the network connecting to the North Bayshore area. I've done a little thinking about how we could potentially use the Google modeling in our own, through our own development review process and our own planning process. And there's the potential to do, a map similar to what Hugh showed, showing the average level of stress for any parcel within the city. So we could feasibly use, what's commonly accepted as the bike shed, which is a 3-mile radius around a point. We could, potentially look at the bike shed for specific parcels or nodes, downtown, Cal Ave, and we could look at the average level of stress from within that 3-mile bike shed, and then we could identify specific gaps, whether it be a roadway crossing, an intersection, or a missing trail segment, and we could direct either our resources or resources that we may collect through other means, whether it be the traffic impact fee, to actually close those gaps and make that parcel accessible from the entire bike shed around the parcel.
That's very exciting. So I guess just the last thing to the city then is it would be nice, especially as this goes to council, kind of show the different options here, right? There's a bit of like the traffic impact fees, there's a bit of TDM layering, there's neighborhood by neighborhood thresholds. I think showing those different levers is really important. I do have a few other small questions, but I want to pass it off to other folks. So I believe Vice Chair, you were first, or? Okay, Commissioner Rosenblum, you always lead us off.
Yeah, I just have a quick question. I wanted to address Arthur Keller's question, and unfortunately he left, but I wanted to first verify that the statement's accurate, that we have a 4-second delay as threshold for triggering a transit review, and City of Menlo Park has a 0.8 second, and I assume that's on like collectors and arterials or something, but first I want to see if that is an accurate statement.
Yeah, so The difference is whether the facility is already at a failing grade. So because Menlo Park and Palo Alto are in different counties, arterials in Palo Alto are set at LOSE per VTA, and then local streets are set at LOSD. So Menlo Park actually has a bit of a more restrictive standard. Local streets are at LOSC and arterials are at LOSD. So then below those points, below those thresholds, you get to the point of saying that the intersection is already below what we want. And at that point, Palo Alto continues the VTA model of if your intersection is already quote unquote failing from a congestion perspective, adding more than 4 seconds of delay, 4 seconds or more, would be a significant impact. It's much more restrictive in Menlo Park. It's 0.8 seconds of delay. And so really what that amounts to is getting a whole lot more impacts for, you know, a very limited number of trips.
So can I?
Robert, do you want to add?
Yeah, I'd just like to add, the 0.8 second is only invoked on Caltrans facilities where you have a local street. So if you're in a non-Caltrans facility, then they just use the 4 seconds as well, which is what is used in San Mateo County. But this was that 8/10 of a second, which is very difficult to calculate in some senses. That 8/10 of a second was implemented probably 10 years ago, and the whole idea was they wanted on state facilities, basically El Camino at the time, they wanted to have a more sensitive one for that facility. So it is a little unique that way. It's not.
And my follow-up is, so he had suggested that Palo Alto adopt a similarly strict standard. And outside of whether or not that's a wise thing or possible thing, I want to understand the impact of that. I would assume the impact is that any project, you have, you know, more of a hair trigger, right? That
yes.
So you have a higher burden for any project. And so it would be, in some ways, quote unquote, slow growth, more difficult to develop projects. Is that correct?
Correct, absolutely.
Okay.
Well, it could lead to two outcomes. It could be more difficult to develop projects, or you could end up, you know, adding capacity of roadways, you know, or more frequently than you would under a lower threshold.
Or potentially force projects to have more aggressive TDM measures, for example. Okay. Thank you. Those are my questions.
Just one before I ask for the next commissioner. Can thresholds be challenged? Does it happen often? I mean,
I'll give an answer, then I'll defer to the attorney. But CEQA allows lead agencies to set their own thresholds for general use. So if you're going to use this for all your projects, Section 15064.7 says lead agencies should adopt their thresholds by a public process, ordinance, or resolution. But they have to be supported by substantial evidence, and that is a legal bar within CEQA in terms of when you're setting thresholds. You can't be arbitrary, and someone could challenge you if the substantial evidence did not support where you chose to draw the line in terms of what's acceptable versus unacceptable. Off the top of my head, one case I can think of where thresholds were challenged was just a couple of years ago. A lot of cities and counties have not adopted their own thresholds. They'll use what's called Appendix G out of the CEQA guidelines. It's a sample checklist of potential environmental topics, but they'll turn it into thresholds because of the way the questions in the Appendix G are phrased. It sounds like you're above the line or below the line. And the court reaffirmed that those are not thresholds. It is a sample checklist, and so they do not have any kind of legal standing as thresholds. So that was one case where they reaffirmed that you local agencies or lead agencies do have the discretion to set your own thresholds if supported by substantial evidence.
I'd just like to add a couple things to that. First, I don't think actually that thresholds get challenged a lot, but I have worked in agencies where we decided not to adopt thresholds, but on a certain subject because we were afraid of a legal challenge. I mean, so it has the effect of kind of influencing local agency decision-making because of that opportunity to challenge local thresholds. The other thing I would say, and this is really interesting to me, of course I respect Arthur a lot, and his suggestion that we re-examine our thresholds is perfectly legitimate. We last adopted thresholds in Palo Alto, 2008 or something. It was during early years of preparing the comp plan, and there was a whole series of thresholds adopted that have since had to evolve a little bit because changes in the law and practice in CEQA. But yes, obviously we could take some time to re-examine those standards and adopt new thresholds based on substantial evidence. The question I have is that effort worth it at this point, or should we be focusing on this change in methodology that the state is forcing on us, and on Commissioner Wolfoger's question, which is how do we translate this technical area into something that is more understandable and people can relate to how they experience transportation challenges. So good, interesting questions.
And just to build off that a little bit, it kind of goes back to the earlier discussion about how do VMT and LOS relate. If people are traveling fewer miles, they're probably traveling through fewer intersections and fewer congested roadway segments. So I think you might be getting to the same outcome that we ultimately want to see, which is to make mobility easier for folks. If they have to travel fewer miles to reach a destination, they may be just as happy as if they're traveling a longer distance through a less congested corridor.
Thank you very much. Commissioner Wolfogel. Oh, you okay? Can I give it to the Vice Chair?
Thanks. Thank you. So I just want to want to add to the discussion, because I also had a question about Arthur's proposal, and he's back on the floor, so he may chime when he wishes to. We talk, Arthur, about your proposal to align ourselves with Menlo Park, if you heard the last comments, and I just wanted to understanding Hilary's point, right? It's possible that we can still live with level of service for many years because of its understandability, and despite of this change in CEQA. So from this perspective, we may consider potential benefits of aligning ourselves with Menlo Park, given that Menlo Park retains its metrics for the years to come. So I would first check with Menlo Park what are the plans with LOS before we go any further. So that's the comment about this. I would like to just go back to the topic that Commissioner Downing opened with the excellent inquiry when she talked about local projects, because we're going to face many of them, and listening to this exchange of comments, I realized that probably at a certain point of time you will provide us with some plan and methodology for implementation of this CEQA change for the projects where you're going to propose the map that's going to relate to the zoning. We will be able to comment on this map and understand pros and cons. Once you're going to do this, I would like to also ask about addressing process, how impact of VMT will influence selection of options for a local project, and how commission will be exposed, how our commission will be exposed to the selection of those different options. I can imagine that staff would be discussing those options with the developer or a builder, how to reduce the impact on VMT on a given project. I would like to understand how our commission would have a say on the selection and agreeing with the potential outcome that would come to our commission from the discussion between the staff and the developer. The reason is that pretty much we may have a different perspective, or we would like to understand the selection process and weighting the best scenario.
Right. Well, I think we're all going to get a whole lot more sophisticated about all of this in the next 2 years. And so I think the first step would be to have a conversation as a community and with staff, with the commission, about how we're going to implement this change in methodology for CEQA analysis, what the thresholds will be. And once we understand that and the methodology for doing these analyses on a project basis, we'll be able to have a conversation about what information analysis the applicant brings to the table, and what staff's analytical response will be, what the commission's role is. But I feel like we have to get a couple steps down the road before we can have a meaningful conversation about that question.
Of course. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Commissioner Waldvogel.
Thank you. Very informative discussion, so appreciate all the thoughtful responses. I think there are a lot of great ideas that we've discussed here, and I think there's probably some community concern about what is the vision point that is somehow captured in the middle of this. I think the CEQA changes are inevitable, but and I love some of the ideas. I love some of the ideas about walkable retail, walking to a store. I'm not sure dry cleaner is what I want to live next to specifically, but they're better than they used to be. But there's other retail that I'd be pretty enthusiastic about. But the thing is, again, the community needs to be prepared for this discussion. There's more here than transportation experience. There's this whole kind of complete disruption in how we think about land use, how we think about, how we circulate, and what we build. I mean, is single-family residential R1 something that survives this methodology over the long term, or does it just not make the cut, in the long term because of some of the objectives that are buried in this? And that's not a 2-year question, that's like a 30-year question. So I'm not really looking for a specific response on that. But again, I just think we have to be as explicit as possible to say what this material implies for what the community looks like. Does it mean we look like Fillmore Street? Does it mean we look like Park Slope? Does it, sort of what's the end goal and where do we get to? And again, I just can't discern it from this particular set of documents, but I believe that they imply some outcomes that I can't discern. The other thing I would just be I would urge you very strongly as you think about technology diffusion and innovation. I've spent my whole career working in diffusion of new technologies, sometimes physical objects, and it turns out that, at least in my experience, it's always slower than you expect in the near term. So, as we think about autonomous, connected, electric, shared vehicles, as we think about those trends, which are quite likely to happen, there'll be way less of it than we think there will be over the next 10 or 15 years. And then, assuming it happens, there'll be very rapid adoption, at some point, at some transition point. And the problem with that is that we're writing plans that go out to 2030 against changes that may not be material until almost the end point of those plans. And I worry about things like, Sarah, you mentioned things you can do in residential to discourage driving. But in the short term, you have huge problems with freeloaders. And so you sort of have to figure out, how do you manage that? I mean, if you charge for parking spaces, 20 years out, that may be wonderful. But in years 1 through 7, all those cars are going to end up parked on a street 2 blocks away. So we have to find ways to sort of deal with people's expectations, to deal with the transitions, to have reasonable assumptions about technology diffusion so that we don't really get ahead of ourselves. So again, I just look for, just really encourage you to think about that and think about how to explain that to the community so that the community doesn't say in 5 years, well, that's not what we expected.
Thank you, Commissioner Waldvogel. I don't believe we have any other questions or comments. So I hope this was helpful. I think it was helpful to us, and I think we gave you a range of comments from the very wide, broad ideas of how do we interpret this, how does the community understand, to some pretty specific questions about VMT. But thank you all for your input and for the support and answering our questions and for your time. Thank you. That closes item 2. Our last item for tonight is approval of minutes from May 25th. I'm not going to be voting on this motion because it wasn't at that meeting, but if there is a motion.
So motion to approve meeting minutes dated May 25.
So we have a motion on the floor to approve the minutes for May 25th. Is there a second? And a second by Commissioner Tanaka. Let's take a vote. All those in favor?
Aye.
1, 2, 3. So we have 3 in favor, 3 abstaining because they were not there. Does that count as a pass?
Actually, you don't have to be present to vote on minutes, so if somebody would vote, we'd appreciate it.
I do too. Okay. Unanimously passes. Thank you all so much. I think that concludes our meeting at 8:50 tonight. Thank you all.